Hey y'all, I just got done recording this and it's a long one. So if you don't know already, go down to that description and you're going to see timestamps. It'll allow you to jump around to different parts of this. So if you're interested in one thing but don't want to listen to 2 hours of other content, you can just skip right to that. This will be a far-reaching video or audio experience focusing on the ideology of Novorossiya and those who promoted various versions of it, ranging from Eurasianists in the 2000s to Vladimir Putin himself. I'll show how these figures and their ideas relate to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which, as we'll see, began much earlier than 2022 and even earlier than 2014. In doing so, I'll discuss some of the major players involved, such as Alexander Dugin, Pavel Gubarev, and Igor Girkin. I'll also show their ties to Russian ultranationalists who played a pivotal role in separatist success. Some of them even have ties to domestic extremists in the US who play nice with fake anti-war pro-Russian groups. While the driving force for these people is reactionary, that is not to say that there were not some who had authentic desire for change in governmental organization from the left. However, these groups were much smaller and had little to do with separatist movements a few months into 2014. Instead, what we'll find is an ultranationalist ideology driving extremists to an imperialistic war through propaganda, religious extremism, political opportunism, and a mythos around the concept of Novorossiya. Novorossiya can mean different things to different people. There is a historical concept, a political concept, and there is an ethno concept of Novorossiya. Here is a historical map of Novorossiya in 1855. Pavel Gubarev would share things like this as propaganda on social media in 2014. Novorossiya loosely translates to New Russia, and it's a term that's been used since Imperial Russia through the Soviet era and into the Russian Federation. The historic Novorossiya covered a third of what is now Ukraine, including Crimea. At the 2013 Valdai Club meeting, Putin declared that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. And the demographics from the era of this map don't show that. It shows Ukrainians being separate, but of course there is a negative connotation or phrase that used to be used to call Ukrainians little Russians. In 2014, he rejected the sovereignty of Ukraine over its southeastern territory because of, in his words, Lenin's clear impulse to give the lands of Novorossiya region to Soviet Ukraine while Russian people remained there. And I bring that phrase up from Vladimir Putin because there are many people, unfortunately, on the left who confuse what's happening in Ukraine for some type of socialist or communist or anti-imperialist movement, which it is not. And here are Lenin's words on the matter. However, we cannot move towards the goal unless we combat all nationalism and uphold equality of the various nations. Whether the Ukraine, for example, is destined to form an independent state is a matter that will be determined by 1,000 unpredictable factors. Without attempting idle guesses, we firmly uphold something that is beyond doubt, the right of the Ukraine to form a state. We respect this right. We do not uphold the privileges of great Russians with regard to Ukrainians. We educate the masses in the spirit of recognition of that right, in the spirit of rejecting state privileges for any nation. This is the counterpoint to what Putin was saying. In the next section or excerpt that I took from this, there is an argument being made that Austria is trying to pull Ukraine away from Russia, essentially by treating them well and respecting their sovereignty. And Lenin argues, why can't Russia do the same? If Russia wants closer ties to Ukraine, then Russians need to begin respecting the sovereignty of Ukraine. The last paragraph compares this to situations that are happening in Ireland and England. Novorossiya is important because it is what the Russian government and separatist leaders called their project in 2014. And while the history is sketchy at best, and the point is simply neocolonialism, it provided historical and political propaganda for their project. In reality, of course, it would allow the Russian government to dominate territory in eastern Ukraine, which is energy rich, stretching to Moldova, and this territory, of course, including Crimea with access to the Black Sea. This would undercut Ukraine's population by about 46 million to 25 million and take away about 45% of the nation's GDP, leaving it severely weakened and much more susceptible to Russian influence. When I said earlier that the infiltration of Russia into Ukraine started much before 2022 or even 2014, this is what I mean. Alexander Dugin, who in the past has been influential in both academia as well as politics in the form of an advisor in Russia, but we'll see who has engaged in other manifestations of political parties and even paramilitary style movements, wrote that Ukraine as an independent state with some kind of territorial ambitions poses a huge danger to all of Eurasia. And without the solution to the Ukrainian problem, Ukraine itself is a problem, it is pointless to talk about continental politics at all. Ukraine should be strictly a projection of Moscow. In the next section, he goes on to state that separatism and the tendencies of political sovereignty are incomparably more active in Ukraine. Ukraine as a state has no geopolitical meaning. It has neither a special cultural message of universal significance, nor geographical uniqueness, nor ethnicity. And that last part is very important when we're talking about the concept of Novorossiya encapsulating something of an ethno-state. The last portion here, the further existence of a unitary Ukraine is unacceptable. The territory should be divided into several zones, which is happening before our eyes, corresponding to the gamut of geopolitical and ethno-cultural realities. Now, Dugin himself, what we'll see is very influential. But before we even get to that, this text was taught in the Russian Military Academy for a number of years. So this is canon. This is curriculum. Novorossiya and ethnicity. This excerpt is from the article, The Far Right in the Conflict Between Russia and Ukraine. Russian nationalists regularly exploited the post-imperial thesis of Russian people being divided by the new borders. In 1998, one of the more prominent thinkers in the post-Soviet Russian nationalism, Alexander Sevchenov, called to recognize the right to unify the ethnic divided Russian nation in the brochure, The Russian Project. Later in 2003, this demand reappeared unaltered in the program of the National Sovereignty Party of Russia, one of the last attempts to create a united, radical nationalist political force. The claim was that Russians are divided. Continuing with another excerpt from the same source. Many ethno-nationalist parties, such as the Russian All-National Union, have also proclaimed that it is necessary to unite Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus into a single state. It was a commonplace idea among Russian far-right figures that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are in fact one nation. This claim was repeated consistently in the programs of the Russian national unity movements. That's important. Remember the Russian national unity movements. But moving down on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, we see that Vladimir Putin himself has echoed these sentiments as well. From Vladimir Putin, during the recent direct line, when I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole. These words were not meant to be some short-term considerations or prompted by the current political context. It is what I have said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe. I therefore feel it is necessary to explain my positions in detail and share my assessments of today's situation. So again, one people. When I told you to remember Russian national unity, this is why. So one of the pivotal figures, or at least one of the earliest figures involved in separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, at least the Donetsk region, was Pavel Gubarev, and we're going to talk a lot about him later. However, he himself was part of that very unit, and there's plenty of documentation of that. We'll talk about what that movement meant, but down and below, we have a quote here. Today, fascism is once again raising its beastly face in the guise of the Kiev junta. Anti-fascist Pavel Gubarev of the self-proclaimed Donetsk governor and Donbas militia commander. And this is something that we're going to see, the idea of anti-Nazism and anti-fascism not having any ideological meaning, but instead a historical, nationalist, patriotic meaning for Russian people. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is from Pavel Gubarev's own social media. And this was posted back in 2015. He's giving an interview, and it states, powerful interview of Pavel Gubarev at the anti-fascist forum in Donetsk. And so again, this is how it can become confusing. If you're outside of the region, you don't understand the history, you don't understand what maybe anti-fascism means to that region. This sounds really good, right? But this person is the same as this person. Regardless of everything that we've talked about in terms of Novorossiya, it's important to know that the people in Ukraine during this time, 2013, 2014, did not want the introduction of Russian troops in the region. I'm showing here on a slide from another video that I have. So if you're interested in statistics, go look for the video, What Do Ukrainians Think? Maidan, Separatism, and War, 21 Years of Data from KIIS. That's up on the YouTube channel or wherever you found this audio podcast. But we can see that if you're watching, 47.5% of residents in Donetsk region said, we absolutely certainly do not want Russian soldiers. Another 18.8% said rather no. Only 9.9% said rather yes. And this parallels into the idea of separatism and what is it that people wanted. Now, this is a little trickier. In Donetsk, for instance, less people wanted things to say exactly the same, only 9.3, but 25.7 and 23.5 wanted to maintain their current status as a unitary Ukraine or have some type of autonomy within federal Ukraine. So in other words, they wanted to stay within the state and maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine. However, they wanted their relationship with the central government to be slightly different. As with any empire that begins to lose territorial possessions, there is inner turmoil and searching for one's identity. And this is true for many former colonial powers. Trying to understand where you now stand in the world, for which at one point in the near past, you held much more power and significance. And that's how we sway back to the idea of Novorossiya and another concept I wanted to talk about, or Russian world. Now, this is interesting. This is an article, and this article is shared amongst many different religious sites. It states the Russian equivalent of blood and soil, which is, of course, goes back directly to Nazism. The Russian equivalent of blood and soil ideology at the heart of Putin's war, explained and rejected by theologians in new statements. And why is it important to look at what religious leaders are saying in all this? Again, because the concept of Novorossiya is much larger than simple geopolitics. And what we'll see is some of the extremist organizations that we're going to get into later, who played a very important role in separatist efforts are not what we think of in the West. And what I mean by that, and I'm not speaking for everybody in the West, but I mean, generally, when we think of far-right movements, we inevitably get to fascism or neo-Nazism, right? Something like that. However, in this region, as I kind of briefly touched upon earlier, and which will become clearer as we move on, specifically Nazism and fascism mean something patriotic and nationalist to Russians, specifically World War II. However, that doesn't mean that the racism, the totalitarianism, the death cult, that all the negative things about Nazism are rejected by Russians. It is just the idea of fascism almost meaning Europe in a way, almost meaning like the West in a way, that becomes a general type of stereotypical way to describe anything that is anti-Russian. So let's draw that back in here. A new statement by Orthodox Christian theologians, some of whom signed from Russia, dramatically illustrates what is at stake in this war, mostly Christians against Christians, and what implications it has for the American scene. And they're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The statement sets its organizers in opposition to Russian world. Remember, I talked about that before, the Russian world teaching, which is essentially a contemporary Russian version of Nazis' blood and soil ideology. As the authors explain, Russian world teaches that there is a transnational Russian sphere or civilization called Holy Russia or Holy Rus, which includes Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and sometimes Moldova and Kazakhstan. The Russian world, according to the ideology, has Moscow as its administrative center and Kiev as its spiritual heart. This is something along the lines of what Alexander Dugin said, in which it is not that Ukraine needs to simply not exist per se, but it needs to be a projection of Moscow, right? Almost like an administrative center from Moscow. The Russian world is further held to be unified by a common language, again, the dismissal of the Ukrainian language, a common church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and there are paramilitaries that targeted Ukrainian Orthodox churchgoers, we'll get to later, and a common political leader being Vladimir Putin. And then moving down, it states that against this Russian world stands the corrupt West, led by the United States and Western European nations, which have capitulated to liberalism, globalization, Christian phobia, homosexual rights, promoted in gay parades, and militant secularism. This, very much like the idea of a Westerner viewing Pavel Gubarev, saying that he is anti-fascist while having himself participated in what someone from the left would view as a fascist organization. But, however, those from that organization, Russian National Unity, would arguably push back against, right? Very similar to that, we see here that there's a lot of propaganda that is anti-globalization, and that gets phrased as anti-imperialism, for instance. Many of the Western sources that will be promoting anti-imperialism will be saying things like, in the West, there's a lack of a materialist analysis, and that instead there's division due to secularism. And this is exactly what's being stated here in the Russian world concept, whether you want to call this some type of ideology or just mere government propaganda or both, right? So that idea that people in the United States focus too much on trans rights, for instance, as opposed to class right, this is where that comes from. It's not some type of unique insight. It's copying what is an extremist and also political message just from another part of the world that people in the West aren't so familiar with. Focusing on the fomenting of separatism in Ukraine. If you're watching, I have a screenshot. This is also from another video, the Nazballs, why are left accounts posting right-wing content? If you want to know more about it, check it out. However, for the purpose of this video, there's a highlighted section from early September of 1994. So 1994. Limonov, Eduard Limonov, visited the Crimean Peninsula, currently part of Ukraine when this was written, not anymore, to take part in pro-Russian separatist rallies on September 6th, 1994. So the point in showing this is to show that even though the National Bolshevist Party was a fringe party, and at times an opposition party to Vladimir Putin, however, it did begin to align with him and eventually come to support him once he expanded extraterritorial ambitions for the state of Russia. But going all the way back to 1994, we have people, and Limonov was influential in his own right, entering into the country of Ukraine and taking part in pro-Russian separatist rallies, or at least trying to foment them and create chaos. Again, from November of 1994, with the same group. At a press conference in the Russo-American Press Center in Moscow, Dugin, we've talked about him a little bit, we'll talk about him more, and Limonov introduced, among others, the following legislative initiatives of the NBP. So I'm going to skip down to our part. So conducting referenda in the former Soviet territories outside the Russian Federation, where ethnic Russians outnumber the relevant title nation, with the view of bringing these territories back into the Russian fold. Again, this is from 1994, and this is where the idea of ethnicity is reasserting itself into the conversation. In 1996, as early as 1996, the same person, Eduard Limonov, part of the National Bolshevist Party, was indicted by Ukraine for instigating attempts to damage the territorial unity of Ukraine, Article 62 of the Ukrainian Criminal Code. In accordance with NBP's policy on the near abroad, Limonov has declared that the Ukrainian city of Sevastopol is Russian property that has been captured by a hostile state and should be defended against force of arms. Moving forward to the year 1996. So as early as 1996, the country of Ukraine was bringing charges against individuals such as Limonov for instigating attempts to damage the territorial unity of Ukraine. 1996. Again, more actions going to 1999. So at this part, Foundations of Geopolitics, or those excerpts that we read earlier from Alexander Dugin, that had already been published and was becoming very influential. In 1999, we have more individuals from NBP entering into the country of Ukraine and protesting, trying to argue that Crimea specifically is actually part of Russia and needs to be brought back into Russia. It states at the end here, later the participants are arrested and charged with an attempt to damage the territorial unity of Ukraine, once again, Article 62. And so why do these protests and people getting arrested in the National Bolshevist Party and Eduard Limonov, why do they matter to us? Because if you're watching the slide, the person on the right is an Eduard Limonov. The person on the left is Alexander Dugin, and Alexander Dugin was a co-leader, and I think you could argue the ideological heart of the National Bolshevist Party, the same person that wrote that book that we looked at previously. Moving forward, again, one could argue, well, yes, but these are French political figures, and this person wrote a book and it was in the military academy for a short period, but that doesn't actually put things into action, we'll say, per se. Even protests or chaining yourselves to flagpoles and things like that, that's not seriously damaging or attacking the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as Ukraine asserted that it was in the 90s. But it goes much further than that. And this is when it becomes extremely important to see how the actions beginning at this time influence what's going to happen in 2014, this era specifically. And what we're looking at, if you're looking at this image, is a summer camp, essentially, or a group of the Eurasian Youth Union. And the Eurasian Youth Union has a flag, a black and yellow flag, something kind of like a compass with, I guess what you could call arrows going in different directions. This was headed by Alexander Dugin himself, and the Eurasian youth movement during this period started holding camps, educational gatherings, information sharing. They began organizing, not in Russia though, but within Ukraine itself. So let's talk about the Eurasian Youth Union, because this is when we start to actually have organizing occur as opposed to just protests within Ukraine. Russian authorities supported the creation of patriotic youth movements, such as Ours, Young Russia, Young Guard, and the Eurasian Youth Movement, or ESM, was one of them. So the ESM was essentially a national Bolshevik youth wing of Alexander Dugin's International Eurasianist Movement, MED. Activists of the Donetsk Republic and Eurasian Youth Union organized and trained together, meaning that Dugin had built a paramilitary activist organization that collaborated with Ukrainian groups as early as the mid-2000s. Branches of the ESM were established in numerous Ukrainian cities, including Kiev. These branches cooperated with the Ukrainian cells of the National Bolshevik Party, as well as Ukrainian far-right parties such as the Russian Bloc, the misleadingly named Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, PSPU, led by Natalia Vitrenko, and Brotherhood, headed by Dmytro Korshensky. Both Vitrenko and Korshensky were members of the highest council of Dugin's MED. So just unpacking all of that, what we see here is that the Eurasian Youth Union was directly connected to Dugin's own Eurasian party. The National Bolshevik Party, for which Dugin was a member or former member, collaborated with far-right elements within Ukraine, Russian Bloc being one of them, and the Progressive Socialist Party being another. Again, that's another interesting thing. If you're from the West, you might look at Progressive Socialist Party as being socialist or communist in the view of a Westerner. However, we'll see that that's not what this party was, given the context of the region, and that people that were in very significant positions in this party, as well as Brotherhood, were again on also the council of Dugin's MED, or Eurasianist movements. Because of anti-Ukrainian thrust of neo-Eurasianism, the leader of the ESM and Dugin were banned from entering Ukraine in 2006 and 2007. So like Limonov before him and other National Bolshevists prior, now we also see that Alexander Dugin himself begins to become banned in 2006, again, for attempting to undo or challenge the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So 2006, right, prior to 2014. If you're watching, to the left is a picture of Igor Girkin with Dugin's Eurasian Youth Union group. So there are two young men holding a Eurasian Youth Union flag, that black and gold flag with the arrows, and Igor Girkin standing next. We will talk about him more later. However, he was part of the annexation of Crimea and became extremely important to the pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine later. But for now, I have a picture of him with the Eurasianist group, just showing how this is also yet another connection. That this is not conspiracy or drawing lines on the wall. We have what becomes the leader, essentially, for a Novorossiya military effort, standing next to Eurasian Youth Union members. Natalia Vitrenko is interesting, one, because she is she's a Ukrainian politician that is working directly with Alexander Dugin. So again, just showing, yes, Dugin was significant, regardless of what people try to say today. But she has been involved with the Progressive Party of Ukraine, which is not progressive in a Western sense, since 1996. She includes LaRouche conspiracies into nostalgia for the Soviet era and attended multiple LaRouche conferences. And that, if you are up on Western sources that propagate this pro-Russian propaganda, the idea of LaRouche being connected, especially this early in the 1990s, should be sounding alarm bells. And if you're not, know that many of the figures on social media, for instance, many of the organizations, and many of the fake anti-war protests that are happening that are just, the pro-Russian rallies, but that LaRouche is integral to these ideas and concepts and messaging, but also current members of LaRoche being directly involved in some of these actions, you could call them, these events with comedians that are, just pro-war, pro-Russian events. Petrenko was a high-level member of Dugin's Eurasian Youth Union as well. So not only is she operating within Ukraine in a political sense, she's also operating within Dugin's Eurasian Youth Union. The PSPU joined the International Russia, or Vladimir Putin's All-Russian Popular Front, ONF. So if you're in with Dugin and you're in with Eurasianism, the concept of having a empire within what is considered Eurasia, then you're in with the idea of Novorossiya, or this concept of a broader, or something that constitutes an empire or broader representation of people, with Moscow being that administrative hub to this larger region. Again, much of which being expressed through ideas of ethnicity. The Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine is described as a national Bolshevik party. So we've already talked about what the Russian version of that was. And was banned in 2022 after the full-scale invasion by Russia. This was pitched along with some other political parties, but this one in particular was pitched to a Western audience as Ukraine being fascist, right? By trying to censor political voices. However, this political voice, as we can see, has been working since the 1990s with Eurasianists on directly, or at least symbolically, on the concept of implementing Novorossiya on behalf of a Russian empire. Natalia Petrenko's political narrative from the PSPU consisted of creating a political union with Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And that should sound familiar now, right? Because we've gone through that with Russian World, we've gone through that with Novorossiya. She labels all advocates of Ukrainian sovereignty Nazis. And this goes to the point that I was making before, to which after going through, after you look at Russian social media for a while, after you look at what politicians from Russia or from these smaller groups like PSPU, once you look at their propaganda for a while, it becomes very clear that the idea of being a Nazi has very little to do with anti-Semitism, has very little to do with militarism, has very little to do with racism, but instead is symbolic of an evil Western force trying to destroy the Russian world, much like what we saw when we looked at this from the religious point of view, the theologians discussing Russian world. Note that Pavel Gubarev, again, one of the founding leaders of Novorossiya, or a separatist movement, at least in Donetsk and in eastern Ukraine, who was part of Russian national unity that we looked at, which is complicated for a Westerner, but maybe we could say just an extremist organization for now, was also a member of Natalia Petrenko's PSPU. So following up on Eurasian Youth Union, those might have been some pretty big bombshells that these people were directly interconnected. And if they weren't, I feel like they should be, because you begin to see where they're coming from and what their worldview is and what separatism means to them. However, going back to Eurasian Youth Union, yet another pro-Russian organization that Dugin's neo-Eurasianists cooperated with in Ukraine was the Donetsk Republic, or DR. And this organization was created in 2005. Again, far before Maidan happened, right? Not 2014, forget 2022. In November of 2006, DR and ESM activists collected signatures to hold a referendum on the independence of the Donetsk Republic. The referendum never took place, but SBU, or Security Forces of Ukraine, and police took notice of the group, and cases were brought against the leaders of the DR. So if you're watching on the left, we have an image of 3 individuals holding the Eurasian flag again, that black flag with the white or with the gold arrows, excuse me. In the background, you see Russian flags. In the background, you see a prototype for what would become the Donetsk People's Republic flag, that black, blue, and red. And then you also see a black, yellow, and white flag. We're going to get to that later. That is an imperial flag, and it can be, doesn't necessarily 100% have to be. However, in this context, you could assume it is tied to the Russian imperial movement, which in and of itself is a white supremacist terrorist organization. In 2009, the DR declared that state sovereignty of the Donetsk Federal Republic that would unite the territories of 6 Ukrainian southeastern oblasts would occur. The same year, they organized a camp with members of the DR trained in using firearms and making Molotov cocktails. So if you're listening, there's an image of a man with an FBI hat on, which is interesting, a t-shirt that says AK-47, a picture for target practice of Bandera, which is often a figure used often in propaganda, Russian propaganda, as well as the flag that would eventually become a flag for the Donetsk People's Republic, except, well, this is a good 5-6 years before any of that. And again, just showing that this is not just paramilitaries in the image that we're looking at now. Again, also with kind of those prototypes or flags that would become emblems of the separatist movements in Eastern Ukraine. We have Donbas in the Eurasian Project, Donetsk, November 24th, 2012. So this is 2012. Donbas in the Eurasian Project, Eurasianism, that idea of having a Russian empire in what is considered Eurasia, all of this being written within Alexander Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics, the same book that we looked at earlier, discussing how Ukraine shouldn't essentially exist. It has no cultural meaning. It needs to be broken apart. It needs to be a projection of Moscow, etc. That this Eurasian project is, if not the same, it's parallel to or very close to that concept of Novorossiya, right? That historical idea that there is an ethnic tie to what today are sovereign countries, and that the sovereignty of those countries can essentially be ignored for this ideological goal tied to ethnicity. For those listening, to tie this all together more so, on the left, I have a screenshot from Pavel Gubarev's social media account from the 29th of March in 2014. He is posting something from the People's Militia of Donbas. And what is it that the People's Militia of Donbas are posting themselves? A video of Alexander Dugin speaking with Pavel Gubarev's wife. So on the 29th of March, Russian political scientist Alexander Dugin appeared in a leaked Skype video conference with Katrina Gubarev, the wife of Donetsk-based separatist Pavel Gubarev. In the call, he reassured her of Moscow's support and further actions that should be taken by the movements. He also stated all presidential nominees should be considered traitors, with only Yanukovych being considered legitimate. He also said that separatists should act in a radical way, and Moscow will later support civil war in Ukraine, saying the Kremlin is determined to fight for the independence of Southeast Ukraine. Following the video's release, a member of Dugin's Eurasian Youth Union was arrested for planning terrorist attacks in Ukraine and recruiting rioters for $500 each to assist in the storming of government buildings. So next in this timeline, even though we've jumped around a little bit, but next in this timeline would be the actual invasion of Ukraine, and that being represented, at least in first, by the annexation of Crimea. While the invasion of Crimea is significant in itself because it is actually the Russian government action that instigated the invasion of Ukraine, it's also important because it introduced the little green men to the soil of Ukraine. It introduced the Wagner PMC onto the soil of Ukraine. It introduced Igor Girkin onto the soil of Ukraine. All of these people, along with other PMCs and factions, will eventually not just stay in Crimea, but move north and east into Donbas. So what did Little Green Men have to do with this idea of Novorossiya? Well, perhaps nothing directly if we're talking about the concept or the ideology, but definitely so if we're talking about putting the wheels in motion to annex territory. So Little Green Men, unmarked Russian soldiers who appeared during the invasion of Crimea in 2014. Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly confirmed that the Green Men of Crimea were in fact Russian soldiers. In April 2015, retired Russian admiral said that Little Green Men were members of special forces units of Russia. After March 2014, unmarked Russian soldiers began appearing in Donbas, either from Crimea or directly from Russia. The Wagner Group, PMC, Russian private military company, which is a de facto unit of the Russian Ministry of Defense or Russian Military Intelligence Agency. After the invasion of Crimea, an estimated 300 PMCs went to Donbas region of Ukraine to bolster pro-Russian forces. Separatist military success was due to these forces and others who crossed from Russia to Ukraine. According to security services of Ukraine, Wagner were in Donbas as early as 2014. And for those of you listening to audio only, on the left of this slide, from a Wagner group on VK social media, we see an image of a soldier giving the white power OK sign in front of a shooting range, very reminiscent of World War II. Wagner Group, PMC. The Wagner Group is a private military company with ties to Russian white supremacists and neo-Nazi far-right extremists. The PMC gained its name due to Hitler's favorite musician being Richard Wagner. The group's leader, Dmitry Dugin, reportedly wears Nazi tattoos, including a swastika, a Nazi eagle, and SS lightning bolts. Ironically, Yevgeny Prigozhin denied claims Russia is fighting NATO and questioned whether they are actually Nazis in Ukraine at all. This article is interesting. It's from the Kiev Post from 2017. But the interesting part is when you get a little bit here. According to earlier investigations by the Wall Street Journal, the Wagner Group, or the informal group, was founded in 2014. The mercenary team was reported to have participated in fighting against Ukrainian forces in Donbas in 2014 and 2015, later switching its activities to Syria. And another media outlet reported that the private military company, mostly referred to as Wagner Group, is directly sponsored by the Kremlin. And then lastly, from this section is the introduction of Igor Strelkov or Igor Girkin. Strelkov being a code name or a name that's used in the military. It means roughly shooter, something along those lines in English. But this is a screen grab from an article that will show Russia's Igor Strelkov or Girkin. I am responsible for the war in eastern Ukraine. So who is Igor Girkin? Why is he important? Well, if you recall, he's the individual that was standing next to the Eurasian Youth Union participants and that large black flag with the gold compass with arrows on it. So he's a Russian Army veteran and former Federal Security Service officer. By his own admission, he led forces into Odessa and Donbas after the Crimean invasion. He became Minister of Defense in the Donetsk People's Republic, self-described Russian nationalist, wanted for the murder of 298 people on Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 that was shot down over a conflict zone in eastern Ukraine. So there's a few important things about this that's meaningful to show. For instance, the purpose of showing the Little Green Men is to show how Russian soldiers were involved in separatist activity from the get-go. Talking about the Wagner Group, well, one is to show the introduction of a ultra-nationalist-led paramilitary being involved in separatist efforts from the get-go. Right? Before they even began in Donbas, they're already in Crimea and working their way up with direct connections to the Russian government. And the purpose of showing you Igor Girkin here is to, again, show that we have a Russian army veteran that was participating in the annexation of Crimea, and then directly after that, moving up into Donbas, but more significantly, embedding himself into the actual leadership of separatists in that region. He became the Minister of Defense in the DPR. These are some excerpts from that article that was showed. It's from the Moscow Times. And it begins with Russian national Igor Strelkov, a former commander of pro-Moscow separatists in eastern Ukraine, has claimed personal responsibility for unleashing the conflict in which 4,300 people, that's outdated now, have been killed. In quotes from Igor Girkin, here it's Strelkov. "I was the one who pulled the trigger of this war," Strelkov said in an interview published Thursday with a Russian newspaper, which espouses imperialist views, he himself being a imperialist. "If our unit hadn't crossed the border, everything would have fizzled out, like in the Ukraine cities of Kharkiv and Odessa." Strelkov, who uses the name Shooter, or Strelkov, to replace his last name Girkin, was quoted as saying, "While Moscow has repeatedly denied supplying the rebels with weaponry and manpower," Strelkov said, "the assistance offered to rebels remains significant. I can't say that we fully provide for them, but we are really helping them," he said, noting that half the rebel army was equipped with winter clothes sent from Russia. It was established that in early March 2014, he, Girkin, arrived on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and coordinated the seizure by Russian servicemen and representatives of the Russian Special Services of military units of the armed forces of Ukraine, local authorities and administration of the autonomy, abduction of servicemen, activists of public organizations, and other citizens of Ukraine, as well as foreigners who were in Crimea. In addition, Strelkov, Girkin, recruits citizens of Ukraine for their further use in organizing and conducting subversive actions on the territory of our states. So this is a statement from Ukraine. Igor Girkin personally instructed two citizens to seize and maintain the building of the Kharkiv Regional State Administration, military units, and law enforcement units in order to seize weapons in the Luhansk region. This brings us to what is known as the Russian Spring, which is the onset after Maidan protests and the Glorious Revolution. We have the Russian Spring in eastern Ukraine. Early events in March and April of 2014. Not all these bullet points have specific days, but they're all within the months of March and early April 2014. The first one does. So this one's on the top because it occurred on the 1st of March 2014. The Council of Luhansk held a vote on a number of topics, such as making Russian an official language and disarming Maidan self-defense units. This type of information, I feel like, is what's more widely available in the West than maybe some of this other information. An important thing here is that people are at this time, people are working with their governments. And in the East, it's probably mostly Party of Regions, right? Yanukovych's party. But at this point, people are still trying to work from within the system to advocate for themselves in ways that can be very justified, all right? The next bullet point, though. Pro-Russian citizens held a rally against the new government, demanding a referendum on whether to join Russia. Buses arrived from Russia to Ukraine with protesters. This occurred throughout many of these protests. License plates have been documented, for instance. Pro-Russian protests occurred in Donetsk, Mariupol, and Odessa, involving the raising of Russian flags, vandalism, and occupation of government buildings. So this is different than that first bullet point, right? Advocating from within your current governmental structure, even if the party, it's the Party of Regions, which is Yanukovych's party, but still, doing that is one thing. and even arguing that, we want some type of different organizational structure for government within the territory of Ukraine is also another thing, right? But those are on one side. Busing in Russian citizens and people creating protests and vandalism, occupying government buildings, and raising Russian flags is a different thing. And these two things aren't the same. And this is what the people in the West, this is what we need to understand, that very quickly, what might have been honest, authentic, good intention, either working from within the current government structure or maybe from people further on the left, actual communists, actual socialists, who might have, seen Ukraine as a capitalist oligarchical society that they wanted to be free. That is not the Russian Spring, right? Those people are almost immediately separated and pulled out and have very little, if nothing, to do with what's about to happen. So what is about to happen? Okay. Pavel Gubarev leads pro-Russian protesters in forcibly taking the Donetsk Oblast administrative building, claiming to be governor of the region. This is the same person that we saw earlier when we were talking about Eurasianists and Russian national unity. So this is that same figure from that picture. And don't worry, we're going to see that picture more, and we're going to talk about who Pavel Gubarev is. Something that's also absent from Western social media are the massive amounts of counter protests in the East during this time. Counter protests occurred in central Donetsk following Gubarev's actions. This was not some type of popular uprising where people were following Pavel Gubarev, attempting to create some type of utopian leftist society or something. Right? This was a strategic attempt at a land grab. And we'll see why it's complicated, because Pavel Gubarev, he'll post everything from saying that, this is the people's revolution to saying essentially that Ukrainians need to be exterminated. But throughout the entire thing, again, we'll get to it, this is about taking that land and giving it to Russia and being a part of Russia for Novorossiya. That's what that concept is all about that we're talking about. So SBU stormed the Donetsk administrative building, arrest Pavel Gubarev and around 70 supporters. Pro-Russian protesters stormed the municipal administration building in Luhansk, forcing the governor to flee under demands of a referendum for joining Russia. Authorities of Donetsk denounced the referendum on the status of the region. So Yanukovych's own party members are saying, this is not good. This is not what we want, right? And there is this idea in the West too, that these are people who are upset about Yanukovych being thrown out of power. Polls in this time show that Yanukovych had extremely low favorability, even in the Donbas region. Most people, even in this region, did not see him as legitimate any longer. And that's a whole other story. And there's other videos on that. But this is something else that's important to understand, that authorities were trying to stamp out these actions that were by pro-Russian Novorossiya separatists, essentially. Members of the Russian Defense Ministry's intelligence directorate, the GRU, were arrested in Donetsk along with Russian protesters during this time. Russian authorities admit 300 members of PMCs, such as Wagner, were active in Donbas during this time. One of them, who is well known because he was arrested, and so he was identified and he actually talked, Anton Ravitsky of the Black Hundreds, an anti-Semitic Russian extremist group, led quote-unquote anti-fascist protests in Odessa during this time. And this, again, is going to be something that we see. You can be anti-fascist and anti-Semitic, and that doesn't make sense in the West. It does in this region if we look at anti-fascism not as being about being, racist or anti-Semitic, but about patriotic nationalist ideas of past glory, nationalism, World War II. One of Alexander Dugin's Eurasian Youth Union members was arrested in March for planning terrorist attacks in Ukraine and recruiting rioters for $500 reportedly, to assist in the storming of government buildings. And these are only a few of the highlights. There's much, much more than this. But this is the tip of the iceberg of what we're seeing. And important for those not in the region to have a clear picture of what occurred, because there's so much misinformation, so much propaganda that is really specifically targeted to people who are left of center, politically speaking, regarding this. And just to remind, so who is this person who is the first governor, right, of Donbas that was leading pro-Russian protesters, along, I'm sure, with a mixture of other people who weren't aware of what was going on, who had genuine grievances too, for sure, right? But who is the person orchestrating and organizing, right, this effort? It's Pavel Gubarev. And if you're listening to this on audio, I just have a mashup of some of the images that we've seen about Gubarev earlier, talking to Alexander Dugin, or at least his wife, and he reposting it on behalf of the militia of Donbas. So Alexander Dugin. The middle picture, his participation in Russian national unity. And that neo-Nazi, again, in Russia, that can be different things, but Russian national unity, at least during this time, was very pro-Nazi and fine with Hitler, as well as some of those LaRoche progressive style parties too that he had been a part of. So this is like the mastermind or the leader in this uprising that propaganda is asking you to kind of support. Now we're going to spend some time on this slide. This is a collage essentially of social media posts ranging from 2014 to 2018 or so. And I put this together to show the propaganda, right? To show the inconsistency in messaging. However, we can draw conclusions about true intentions and ideas based on Pavel Gubarev's past and actions in the future from most of these posts. But the point in going through some of these and looking at his social media posts is to show how there is a wide net that was tossed, trying to appeal to many different people in order to gain support for separatism in the region, right? That just didn't exist in any kind of majority number prior to the Russian Spring. And many of these tweets, or they're not tweets, they're from mostly BK, I suppose, but most of these posts are going to be contradicting each other. And some of them we can glean some insight into what it is that he actually believes, which is important because he is in a leadership position early on in these events. So I'll just kind of go through some of these and then talk about the inherent contradictions in them. He has a post from 2014, February. So this is during still Maidan. The Putinization of Yank and USSR 2.0, exclamation points. So from 2015, this one we've seen already, powerful interview of Pavel Gubarev at the anti-fascist forum in Donetsk, which is laughable. So, it's laughable because of who he is. And I included on the bottom a comment which calls this out, even on VK, that says, once he was a member of RNE, and now he speaks at an anti-fascist forum or an AFOS forums. So just the inherent contradiction in that. Here's a post from 2016. So this is after, Girkin is there, all the ultra-nationalists from Russia are there, all the PMCs are there. This is after all of that, right? Pavel Gubarev puts out there in 2016, Donbas does not want to move away from Ukraine, but he wants respect. He wants to determine his status in Ukraine. And it's just mind-numbing that he would post something like this when the year before, in 2015 in April, he posted Ukraine as a threat to Eurasian integration. So the contradiction, this doesn't track, right? But it doesn't, that's not the point. This is just propaganda. Some of this is giving us some insight. Putinization of Yanukovych, that's somehow a good thing. Ukraine as a threat to Eurasian integration. So Eurasian integration is Eurasianism. That's Dugin. However, also, he's saying Donbas does not want to move away from Ukraine, right? Blaming Ukrainian forces for the issue. Other things. 2015. I don't know a single person who believes in the Minsk truth. If there are any, write in the comments and please explain. He posted often condemning the Minsk truth. 2014. What kind of federalization? I don't want to live with these morons in the same country. Only Novorossiya as part of USSR 2.0. So this is 2014. There's a very long post adjacent to that on the left that shows potential outcomes, right? Potential, and one of those is federalization while maintaining the territorial integrity of Ukraine minus Crimea. However, a year before, he's saying, what kind of federalization? I don't want to live with these morons in the same country. Only Novorossiya. So I'm showing this because the point is that there's a lot of propaganda. Again, it's a wide net. It's meant to capture a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas. However, it's obscuring what's really happening as well. You know, by saying like Ukraine doesn't, or Donbas does not want to move away from Ukraine, it just asks for respect. That line is something that I think many people center of left in the West would believe in and support and gravitate to, because of the amount of misinformation that has been cast specifically in that area. However, we see by his own tweets, posting straight up Eurasianist stuff, posting straight up anti-federalization stuff, posting straight up anti-Minsk, you know, that's never going to work stuff, advocating for Yanukovych to become like Putin. This is what many in the West do not see, right? This is the stuff that gets left out for whatever reason. So to hammer this point home of Pavel Gruberev saying a lot of things, and it's not just him. I mean, this is all the misinformation coming out of Russia's social media, but also RT, infiltrating red-brown networks, you know, getting onto Facebook and Twitter. These are all the contradictions, right? But moving on to Pavel saying a lot of things. The purpose of this slide is to show all the different eras of Russian history, essentially, that he advocates for and uses for propaganda. And it's not him, it's Novorossiya sites that he's, you know, reposting essentially as well. And for those who are listening on audio, I have a screenshot of a post from 2014 that shows a number of fists in the air and a swastika. And so, you know, this is, again, attempting to be like anti-fascist, but appealing to World War II, right? As if the People's Militia of Donbas is this righteous anti-fascist organization, again, reforming to fight the Nazis of Europe. And to the right of that, there's another anti-fascist slogan, which has been used forever. I mean, these were on punk patches in the 90s, you know, anti-fascist stuff of a fist going through a swastika. Interesting, there's the orange and brown Even in this, there's some homage to that Russian nationalism too, of St. George's ribbon. But below that, Dils, which is a derogatory term for Ukrainian people, right? Dils often cite the phrase Kievan Rus in justification of the Ukrainian national idea. So he's going through, I'm not going to read it all, talking about how essentially they're Kievan Rus is one people, right? That they fought under slogans for the Russian land Orthodox. And this is, is significant too. One, it dismisses or tries to undo the legitimacy of someone claiming to be Ukrainian, or that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country. This is often depicted in Russian nationalist literature as people who are like mentally ill, right? Or outsiders, people with problems, people that are creating problems. They're the Nazis, right? Whether or not those people have anything to do with fascism or not, it doesn't matter, right? But it's their distorted view of themselves as not being Russian. That's the problem. And something else that's important at the bottom for Russian land Orthodox, what we see are that many of the extremists involved in this region aren't necessarily neo-Nazis in that they're wearing swastikas from like the German era, but what we do find are many religious fundamentalist extremists that have ties to the Orthodox Church and ties to Russian imperialism, that harkening back to the Russian Empire. And so this idea of everybody coalescing around Orthodox, meaning Russian Orthodox, actually is pretty significant in terms of propaganda for this region. And to that point, in the center, there are some images of Kievan people from that era, Kievan Rus, that look like Vikings, essentially, appealing more to that the imperialist radicalism. In the upper right, we have Pavel Guvrev talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and how positions are sold for VIP cars in vain, waiting for a civil conflict on this ground. All right, so why include things about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is part of this idea of people in Ukraine having a separate culture. Part of that separate culture is not being a member of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is something that is specifically targeted by Russian nationalists, ultranationalists, and we're going to see specifically there were members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who were targeted by some of these paramilitaries. Below that, and these are reposts from Patriots of Novorossiya and the People's Militia of Donbas. And again, these are, the Patriots of Novorossiya has Ukraine kind of split along the region of Donbas, and then Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine has the right sector shield on it, because everything with this Novorossiya kind of space in social media, everything is right sector during this time. There's not even a lot of Azov battalion stuff like you see more on Gray Zone and with the grifters in the left today on Twitter. The Azov is there, but everything was centered around right sector during this time of propaganda. And so there's a swastika with barbed wire, and then on the right there's the flag that we saw way back in the 2000s, right, with the Eurasian youth protests and people going into Ukraine from Russia trying to have referendum on Crimea and things like that. It's that black, blue, and red. And to the right of that, the People's Militia of Donbas has an interesting combination, like a mashup almost of Soviet era, imperialist era, and Russian Federation, in a way kind of like combined into this single thing, which again, I think is very insightful. People in the West, again, don't necessarily have a conceptual understanding of what like anti-fascism might mean. In many cases, it just means anti-Europe, right? Anti-Westernism. And that the presenting of Soviet images isn't necessarily advocating for some type of like Marxist or Leninist society. in many ways, it's trying to just harken back to a nationalist history of Russia. These are posts from Pavel Guvrev in 2013. One's from October, one's from November. The November is about a Russian march in Donetsk on November 4th, and then the other kind of like retweeting or reposting, I should say, this is from LiveJournal, which it actually, the link still works. America is the only real threat to humanity. So two reasons for showing this. One, because there are many Twitter accounts today by Westerners, right? Western fake leftists, that I could see, just grabbing that LiveJournal and posting it themselves, right? America is the only real threat to humanity. Meanwhile, the person posting that was a former member of Russian National Unity, that's working with ultra-nationalists and just insane fundamentalists from Russia to create a coup in eastern Ukraine. But aside from the LiveJournal, the link for the march in Donetsk, which also went to the LiveJournal, worked as well. And I grabbed some screenshots of it. And it's very insightful for maybe people in the West to understand how this type of misinformation works, because this is presented as, again, residents of Donbas, right, protesting. It's trying to make this into a grassroots thing. And he also talks about members of right sector trying to cause trouble, becoming involved. But when we watch it, what we're going to see are many of those same flags that we saw with the Eurasianists earlier, that were having referendums in the 2000s about trying to separate Crimea from Ukraine. And we're going to see other people using those same imperial flags too. So it's almost as if the audience doesn't know what that's all about. Okay, so these are some screen captures that I got from the video. The first thing that you see is that it's very small. It's not some type of like big mass thing. There are larger protests that occur for sure, especially in urban areas. But again, that raises the question of propaganda and organizing and general grievances versus the Novorossiya goal, right, of the people who are orchestrating things, trying to bring that into reality, and how everyone is probably not aligned on what it is that they're trying to do, for sure. But this was supposed to be like the residents of Donetsk protesting, Nazis of Kiev. And in these still framed images from the video, we can see a few different things. One, okay, so we see the separatist flags that have existed since the 2000s, right? Okay, that makes sense. We see the black, gold, and white flag used by ultra-nationalists and other imperialist groups, specifically RIM, or the Russian Imperial Movement. Doesn't mean that these people are part of RIM. I don't know, right? You can wave the imperial flag and not be a member, but it's a flag that they use. And it's a very small group of people. So take for that what you will. Something that I'm going to say too, to kind of maybe make that more of a reality, is that we see that black and gold Eurasianist flag on the top. It's cut off, but you can see the two arrows pointing down too. So this being presented as residents of Donetsk, protesting against the Kiev junta Nazis. It's what a lot of people in the West on social media believe, unfortunately. It's what a lot of people in the West, propagate as propaganda. But when you look at what's happening and you look at first of all, the number involved, it's not a mass thing. So this is a group, right? And then you look at the flags involved. Well, that's kind of odd that they have that imperialist flag. That's what Russian Imperial movement uses, and other imperialist movements that have nothing to do with socialism or communism, for that matter. But, maybe it's just people, I don't know, grabbing it for nostalgia, right? You don't need to be part of RIM to wave their flag, but that Eurasianist flag is there as well. The picture starts to become clear. This is not some grassroots thing. right? These are the same people that we saw like a decade earlier, essentially, right? It's that group. But if you don't know that, if you're not aware of what was happening in 2006 that we went through, you wouldn't know what's happening here. All right, this is not a protest of people, residents in Donetsk. These are most likely people with very extremist ideas, at least some of them, if you're walking around with a Eurasianist flag and imperialist flags, that don't represent the majority of what the people in Donbas want. That's not how it's presented because this is propaganda. What we're viewing here, and for audio listeners, it's a screenshot of 38, it's not all 38 photos that were part of like an album on Russian social media from a Russian march for Novorossiya 2014. And what you see are the exact same flags being used. Right now, this is in Russia, but it's for Novorossiya, right? And you see the Russian imperialist flags being flown, the black, gold, and white. You see that old black, blue, and red flag being flown as well. You see some other separatists flags too. Those people in that prior video are not just ordinary residents of Donetsk who are scared and fighting against right sector and the Nazi coup in Kiev. And so let's get into it, because I've talked a little bit. We talked about the Wagner group, which at one point was seen as a neo-Nazi unit, which has since exploded into the use of prison labor and many other things. So it has moved beyond just that. But we talked about Russian national unity, and for audio listeners, we see a Russian national unity flag. It's a type of swastika, right? It's a red and white emblem. And then we see the black, gold, and white flags too here. So we talked a little bit about the Russian imperial movement, but not much. So let's talk about them. So who are Russian nationalists? This is from an article, Russian National Unity, from March 2021. Where did I find this? I found this on the Russian National Unity Russian social media page. So this is not some type of propaganda. This is them telling you. And in their image of who they are, guess what flags you see along with their own flag? The Russian imperialist flags that Pavel Gruvrev was trying to pawn off as being like residents of Donbas. So the Russian imperial movement. I have some things up here because one, I have a capture from their Russian media account too, Russian imperial movement with the imperial flag. Right? That's their emblem. So drawing that connection, right? But then on the right, I have a post by Alexander Barkashov, who is basically reposting something from the Russian imperial movement's account. The content kind of doesn't matter. I clipped it off. The point is to show that Alexander Barkashov is looking at Russian imperial movement stuff and reposting it. Who is Alexander Barkashov? He was the founder of Russian National Unity. So these groups are all connected. And it goes to Pavel Gruvrev. He would have known what was happening in that video, right? So that's the type of propaganda that people in the West aren't going to understand. Okay, so let's talk about RIM. RIM was designated a terrorist organization in 2020. This is unprecedented. It's the first international group designated as a terrorist organization that's a white supremacist group. It conducts training for neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Its identifier is a flag with black, yellow, and white stripes. It trained and equipped pro-Russian fighters in eastern Ukraine. RIM operated under direction of Russian support in the DPR and LPR following Maidan 2014. Looking at the statement from the government website, the US government website on this, it states that RIM is a terrorist group that provides paramilitary style training to neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and it plays a prominent role and trying to rally like-minded Europeans and Americans into a common front against their enemies. RAM has 2 training facilities in St. Petersburg, which likely are being used for woodland and urban assault, tactical weapons, and hand-to-hand combat training. This is from an article in 2020, Inside White Supremacist Russian Imperial Movement Designated Foreign Terrorist Organization by U.S. State Department. So here, going down a bit, we have the leader of RAM saying that it's a reward to be designated a terrorist organization by the United States. The terrorist designation marks a U.S. shot across the bow on Russian authorities' relative tolerance of RAM and an associated paramilitary training operation outside of St. Petersburg. This part is very insightful. Links to war in Ukraine. And for those listening, there's an image of none other than Igor Girkin. The designation comes amid concern over increasing violence by far-right groups as militant Russian ultranationalists dream of creating a worldwide movement. Important to note, Novorossiya kind of foundational to that. One of the first to congratulate the organization after the U.S. terrorist designation on April 6th was Igor Girkin, a former Russian intelligence officer charged with murder by Dutch authorities in the downing of the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in 2014. Girkin also faces sanctions imposed by the United States and European Union. Quoting Girkin himself, "I take the opportunity to congratulate my esteemed comrade in arms." There you go. Right. The leader of a DPR military operation saying, "I take the opportunity to congratulate my esteemed comrade in arms." RID is the Russian Imperial movement on receiving a high award, official recognition of their terrorist organization by the enemies of Russia and the Russian people. Nothing about Ukrainians. Girkin wrote on his social media using the Russian acronym for RAM. RAM, which describes itself as a Russian Orthodox monarchical movement, so this is what I've been talking about, often post anti-Semitic and anti-LGBT tropes. So you can do that and not be fascist. You can do that and be anti-fascist in this world, right, that these people live in. Its themes include the collapse of Russia under incompetent and corrupt elites and a coming clash of civilizations. The State Department's move against RAM was its first designation of an extremist far-right group as a terrorist entity, reflecting growing concerns about the violence of such groups. So back to the social media, right? Here's another thing that I could see being misconstrued by folks in the West. So this is a group of pictures from the Russian imperialist movement's social media that exists on Russian social media. And it says, on March 9, 2014, a rally was held in St. Petersburg in defense of the Russian population of Crimea and other regions of occupied Ukraine. The action was organized by the Russian Imperial movement with support of Orthodox patriotic organizations of the city. So if you leave out that second part and you say that this is a rally in St. Petersburg in support of the Russian population of Crimea, that's a big talking point. Not only about Crimea, but specifically about Donbas, that there is this junta, this coup in Kiev, right? Yanukovych was a legitimate president, which he was not at that point, and that Nazis took over, which they did not, and that they were targeting ethnic Russians, which they were not. Okay. Were there parts? Were there specifics? Were there specific people like in the Azov battalion at that time? Sure. Right? But that's not what was happening from a top-down hierarchical government structure. However, right? So this could be bought and sold to people who would call themselves progressive or leftists in the West. However, who is holding this? Who is promoting this? Who is promoting this concern for ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine? A white supremacist terrorist organization that also happens to be Christian fundamentalist in the specific Russian Orthodox faith. And that is what is lost, is that when you begin to see who it is that is saying these things, then the things that they are saying are more open to being questioned. The backlash in the West is that, oh, you're just simping for, you know, the U.S. government, or you're just towing the line because you're an imperialist. No, no. It's actually looking at the Russian imperialists themselves movements and their participation in separatist efforts in Donbas in 2014, and how misinformation that even they, who are designated terrorist organization, even a misinformation that they spread can easily be repackaged and sold to folks in the West. And don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. If you're listening on audio, I have two screen captures. One is from the Imperial Legion in Novorossiya. Fighters of the paramilitary wing of the Russian Imperial movement, Imperial Legion, are fighting for freedom and the Russian peace in Novorossiya, which does not exist. One of the flags is specifically interesting in this, you know, mashup of different pictures, that it's people holding flags, it's people with guns, it's tanks, it's people in Ukraine. But one of them is interesting. There's the separatist flag, right? The black, blue, and red. And then there's the imperialist flag used by this terrorist organization, the black, yellow, and white. And then in between is a flag that you sometimes see RIM fly, or other radical Orthodox fundamentalists, which is a red flag with a depiction of Christ, I believe, in the center of it. So to the right of that is another screen capture. So this is from the Russian Imperial Movement's account as well. It says Imperial Legion in Novorossiya 2015. So here's the documentation. It's not me saying that they were there. They're glad. I mean, it's not that I'm breaking anything. This is not news, right? They themselves have promoted this. It's just in the West, we don't see this, because in the West, for ideological or for monetary purposes, they don't want the West to know about this, right? They want a specific narrative, which in the West is less right sector orientated and more obsessed with Azov battalion, but also this just Russian propaganda about what's happening in Ukraine. You know, this actually complicates that, right? So this is from them. This is their account. 2 of our comrades are gone. They look unsightly. It was worse with equipment then than it is now. Ordinary Russian men who came to this war earlier than everyone else for 8 years. They are telling you that they've been there for 8 years. These are their folks, right? So here's another screenshot that we see. Sometimes the Russian nationalist paramilitaries will like invert the flag and have it being upside down. But the purpose of showing this is to show who they are. And if you're listening, it's a group of 4 men. They have ski masks on. Some of them have their eye holes cut out so that they can't be identified. They're in the back of a van, and they're all holding various versions of machine guns, right? But it's an appeal of Kirikov partitions. So this is asking people of the city in Ukraine to join them, right? But the date is significant. The date is from 2014, right? So these folks have been there essentially from the very, very earliest points too. Just like Russian National Unity that we'll see, just like the Wagner group was, just like Girkin was, just like all the other PMCs that the Russian authorities admitted to. Why am I hammering that home? To show you these were the vanguard of the military success of the separatist movement in 2014. Without this, it wouldn't have happened. That's what Igor Girkin was saying when he says, I was the one that pulled the trigger, right? Without those forces coming up through Crimea and other forces coming from Russia, the war that's happening today would not be happening. Again, going through their socials, it's not an uncovering of something. It's not a breaking story. It's just showing people in the West what happened. And this is just another screen capture from their accounts, the Russian imperialist movement accounts. This is them saying it. it says, so war. And then there's a long paragraph about their involvement in it and, what was happening. But I have underlined this one part. The same Ukrainian directory, the same Entente, very interesting. I won't go into that here, is only now called differently. In 2014, we started this war. Russian volunteers. Just stopping there without even going into everything else. The Russian Imperial movement's social media account. In 2014, we started the war. Russian volunteers. Separatist leaders had no intent on ever negotiating or working with Ukraine at various stages of escalation of the conflict. And I just have a sample, essentially, of Pavel Guvrev's postings showing this, whether it's talking about the February of 2014 and negotiating with the folks involved with Maidan. He says you cannot do that. Whether he's talking about the Minsk Accords, 2015. I don't know a single person who believes in the Minsk truce. Whether he's talking about should there be, an autonomous or federative system of government while maintaining Ukrainian boundaries, 2015. Donbas and Russia are an inseparable link. So, in 2014, in the summer, I think that this is very telling. So June of 2014, regarding the second round of consultations with the junta. So he refers to representatives from Kiev as the junta. The war in Donbas, the signing of the association agreement with the EU, against the backdrop of these events, I do not see the point in consultations. Donbas is the heart of Russia, so it was, so it should be, and so it will be. So in the summer of 2014, only a few months into the Russian spring, he's already saying that he can't, there's no negotiation, that we are part of Russia. That was the point the entire time. That is the Novorossiya project, at least from an ideological point of view. And then there's a much more political point of view, leadership that we'll see come in later that we're not going to talk about in Eastern Ukraine, which really makes this more of a formal Russian land grab, right? But even at this early stage in 2014, a few months into it, during that summer of the Russian spring, right, it's called, the war in Donbas and the signing of the association agreement with the EU, those are the tipping points for him. Who started the war in Donbas? And Yanukovych was supposed to have signed the association agreement himself, right? These aren't some these are excuses, right, to push this propaganda. And by the way, on that post, there's also a Soviet era, propaganda. So harkening back to the USSR imagery that, for different reasons, would probably be meaningful to people who are like, leftists in the West, right? Separatist leaders had no intent on ever negotiating or working with Ukraine. These are some more posts, and I won't read through them all, but just in summary, one of them is from 2014, and Pavel Guvrov is saying, it looks like we have integrated ourselves to Syria. Amen. This is a civil war. Exclamation point. Another from 2014, in which he lays out the things that would need to happen for negotiations to occur. And, they're unrealistic things such as withdrawal of the DILO troops, the DIL troops, recognition of DPR and FPR by the Yukis, and, just stopping there. Even the words that he's used, these are derogatory terms that he's using, right? And negotiations on the peaceful division of the former Ukraine. So he's not negotiating. And this is, in the summer, or this is in June of 2014, the summer of 2014, when he's saying that the Donbas is linked to Russia. So at no point were there did leadership in the early stages of the Russian spring, at no point did they have any interest in talking to Kiev. And this is really illustrated in a post on the left. It's a little bit longer, so I won't read it all, but this is a repost from the People's Militia of Donbas, April 19, 2014, and it's talking about Yulia Tymoshenko. And essentially, so she's a politician from Ukraine. There's a lot of history with her going back to the Orange Revolution. She was put in jail by the Yanukovych regime under some questionable charges of stealing money from a foreign position that she had. But that was a major obstacle to even getting towards the signing of an association agreement. Forget about actually doing that, but like the precursors to that are you can't do things like put your political opponents in jail, which is arguably what Yanukovych did. All right. So anyway, in this context, she is visiting to try to talk about negotiations and how to set them up. And reading through this, essentially, what the People's Militia of Donbas is saying is that, they were good in that they allowed her to leave their territory, and that they are going to investigate and submit to international authorities for crimes against the people of Donbas. So this is not just even rhetoric of like Pavel Gruverev saying this is what I think. This is the People's Militia of Donbas telling you how they treated a representative from Kiev who came to negotiate. Essentially, you're lucky that we allowed you to leave, is their stance. So continuing with this, and this gets into the propaganda part of it all. Separatist leaders had no intent on ever working with Ukraine. In June of 2014, Pavel Gruverev writes something that could be seen as reasonable, I suppose. He says, I write personally, many argue about whether it is necessary to divide the former Ukraine or can it be left, destroying Bandero fascism. Even there, my answer is this. Ukraine should be divided into a federal Novorossiya and a federated Ukraine, because most residents of the west and center of the former Ukraine want a European future, and the south and east see a future with Russia. And this split is based on civilizational, cultural, ethnic, and ultimately economic components. At its core, today, events in the Donbas are a clash between Western civilization and Russian civilization. This could still be construed in the West as someone being reasonable. Look, this part of the country wants one thing, the other part of the country wants another thing. Be peaceful, negotiate, stop the war, and allow them to split. Right. Well, the argument underpinning this is what Alexander Dugin wrote about in 1997. I mean, it is straight from Foundations of Geopolitics, which makes sense, as Pavel Gruverev, being part of Russian national unity and participating in quote-unquote progressive political organizations in Ukraine that had direct ties to Eurasianist organizations, which were headed by Alexander Dugin himself. It makes sense that he would say that. But further from me saying it would make sense, he is saying it makes sense. Again, that post from 2015, Ukraine as a threat to Eurasian integration. This is what Alexander Dugin said about Ukraine. We have Gruverev posting things by Alexander Dugin. We have his wife earlier speaking directly with Alexander Dugin. And then we have this from 2015. The Russian Spring came a year ago in which he's talking about what happened. The Russian Spring was an adequate response to Kiev's Maidan Sabbath. Right? So getting orthodox about it. The Russian Spring began under slogans, home to Russia and down with the oligarchical power of traitors. The Russian Spring is a miracle of awakening of our people from 23-year-old illiberal thieves suspended animation. The Russian Spring is the beginning of our victory over Ukrainian Nazism. The Russian Spring is the beginning of the reorganization of the world on fundamentally new and just principles. This is the end of the unipolar world. Well, there's a lot there too. There's too much to unpack. But know that the propaganda involved in that post is mirrored today by many fake leftist groups. And we'll see that. Specifically, the talk of this being the end of the unipolar world. But lastly, to kind of wrap this section up, to bring you through the entire cycle of this misinformation and propaganda about negotiating with Ukraine. So we've seen the more reasonable, although still insulting, tweets or excuse me, not tweets, postings from his social media. we've seen the propaganda appealing to Soviet era. We've seen the propaganda appealing to the imperialist era. We've seen the propaganda saying that, they're fighting Ukrainian Bandero Nazism, et cetera, et cetera. But throughout it all, we've seen that at no point was he ever serious about the Minsk truce. At no point was he ever serious about trying to negotiate something with Ukraine, mocking Ukraine government officials coming to discuss concessions or setting up some type of negotiation. And throughout all of it, posting about how Donbas is part of Russia. But perhaps this is, the ending, going through that tube and getting out the other side. So this is Pavel Gubarev in 2017. He's posting a quote from Dmitry Tsiv, this political sociologist, ethno-sociologist, philosopher. So what does the quote say? Today's Ukraine should be liquidated as a country, state, and economy. The establishment of relations between Russia and Ukraine, which was carried out in 1991 to 2014, is nothing more than the strengthening of the Ukrainian anti-system. Right? So without even going through it all, and he goes back to talk about Novorossiya, the Ukrainian SSR. Today, Ukraine should be liquidated as a country. Liquidated as a country, a state, and an economy. That use of that the use of that term is done with purpose, for sure. And then on the right, this is from Twitter account Russian Media Monitor. They just comb over Russian media and repost it with translations or either embedded in the video with closed captioning. So Pavel Gubarev, Russia's DPR figure in Donetsk, this is much later in 2014, states their intent towards Ukrainians. We aren't coming to kill you, but to convince you. Okay, reasonable. But if you don't want to be convinced, we will kill you. Okay, not reasonable. We'll kill as many as we have to. 1 million, 5 million, or exterminate all of you. So liquidation and extermination are where, when you start out at the beginning of this, talking about negotiating with Ukraine, and then you go through that tube of propaganda and pop out the other side, this is where you end up at. The same figure talking about extermination and reposting things about liquidation. This is the person. This is one of the initial people of this movement. He is one of the first leaders in the region. He led some of the earliest occupations of government buildings. Separatist leaders try to force their own kind of Maidan, hoping for a Crimea outcome. So coming out of the social media stuff for a while, there is a false narrative in the West that people of Donbas were merely defending themselves from Ukrainian forces. The reality is that individuals such as Pavel Gubarev were instrumental in organizing actions against government buildings and officials, along with busted Russian protesters and Russian special forces. Their actions were neither peaceful nor democratic. In many instances, these organized protests forcibly took over government buildings, resulting in compliance or forced removal of government officials. This was not a socialist or communist uprising, right? At least not at this point. Here's a post from very early on in separatist efforts. This was by Pavel Gubarev too. It's a repost, but it's important because it shows how this happened. So this is on social media. This is people reposting this, right? So what does this say? It says, we will be able to show the entire world community that the positions of the so-called European integrators are absolutely small in the land of Donbas, whose residents do not want to be part of gay Europe, a member of NATO, and other anti-Russian Westerners. We are all going to the regional administration today by 1730 p.m., all on the OGA. Together, we are a force. Together, we will win. And there's a picture of like a mass group of people with flags. Even in this propaganda, that's it's trying to depict what's happening again as like a grassroots thing, and it's a call to action to try to tell people to come and join people like, Pavel Gubarev and all of those associated with that crowd in this uprising. But even in this, which is again kind of attempting to be like a grassroots effort, we still have these right wing hate. Gay Europe is a center of this, right? And the idea of NATO and being anti-Russian Westerners, whereas in the West they're just saying we just want a country that's sovereign and free from interference from Russia, right? But more importantly, it's just significant to show, okay, this is what it looked like to people, right? So come meet us at this administrative building, right? At this time, we're going to win together, and as if this is like a righteous thing. Right. And this is important because it isn't like everybody involved came from Russia. It's not like everybody involved were a part of Russian extremist groups. They weren't. There were people with genuine grievances who were apolitical, meaning, that they weren't part of a socialist or, communist group or something that had other ideas about what revolution looks like. Many of these people are just upset for many reasons that are shared in many different countries about poor leadership. Russian Spring turns violent. So I showed this earlier, but I think it's just important because, again, even at the outset, there was no desire to have a peaceful outcome, right? This was supposed to be a civil war. And the idea is that Russia was going to essentially turn Donbas into Crimea, right, with annexation. This is from February 16th of 2014. I mean, technically, things are still happening in Kiev at this point, right? From now on, I believe only enforce as the only means of restoring constitutional order. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? Even at this point, right? We haven't gotten to the Russian Spring yet, really, but even at this point, right? Violence is the only way to resolve this. Here, I have another capture from Pavel's account. This is from April of 2014. It's a repost from the People's Militia of Donbas. It shows someone in a tank shooting machine gun, maybe at a person running towards him who looks to be a civilian or past him. But regardless, it states, "It is better to be friends with Russians. It is useless to fight with us." So the People's Militia of Donbas is saying we're Russians, right? It's better to be friends with Russians. It's useless to fight with us, the People's Militia of Donbas. Separatist militias and activists storm government buildings. So again, this is not necessarily about all of the specific aspects of the Russian Spring, but this is about Novorossiya. But it's important to see what Novorossiya was, what separatism was. And so these are posts from that era. Pavel Gubarev reposting People's Militia of Donbas, calling on people to come out, essentially, in April 6th and April 7th of 2014, very early on in the Russian Spring. All those who are able and unable to hold weapons, urgently to the SBU building. If there are a lot of us here, they won't storm. So talking about occupying government, buildings and stuff. Activists of the People's Militia of Donbas at 3:32 a.m. seized the SBU of the Donetsk region. This is also important because there was this idea of and especially on Gubarev's account, that people, that residents essentially, took over buildings peacefully. And as a matter of fact, that, the majority of those in the government peacefully stood to the side for the people. Things like that were being posted. The idea that everybody was in agreement of what was happening. That wasn't the case, right? These occupations of very early government buildings were neither peaceful nor democratic. The people who were elected in most of these positions weren't people from Kiev. The people are mostly from party of regions in this area, to be honest. So it's not even like a grievance against Yanukovych or anything that happened with Maidan. This is trying to create a separate Novorossiya to integrate into Russia. And the storming of these buildings were not always peaceful, and they definitely were not democratic. They were done by force. And so this is from a video of the storming of a building in Donetsk. And here are more screenshots of that same building being taken over. Here's the Party of Regions calling on the residents of Donetsk People's Republics to lay down their arms. So this is what, this is what I was speaking to earlier. Kind of skipping down, the People's Militia of Donbas declares that we do not recognize the power of the nationalists over ourselves, and we have not resigned ourselves to the Kiev junta. We proclaim the independence of the Donetsk People's Republic, and now we are fighting for the lives of our citizens against the Ukrainian nationalist army. Well, put all the propaganda aside about fighting for their lives from the Ukrainian nationalist army. What this is saying is that local officials who are part of the Party of Regions, who are Viktor Yanukovych's own party, right, that as early as April 16th of 2014, they're already saying we're not talking to you. Again, going to the idea that at no point was anybody ever serious about negotiating anything. Forget about people coming from Kiev. They won't even negotiate with Yanukovych's own party. It's at this time when Igor Girkin arrive, Little Green Men arrive, other PMCs arrive. It's around this time that the Wagner group is beginning to make its way up, right? So this is in April 26th, the People's Militia of Donbas, stating that Donbas, the DPR government, transferred control of the Republic's power block to the commander of the People's Militia of Donbas, Igor Strelkov. So at this very early point, we already have the figure that we've looked at who said that I'm the reason why this war happened, right? Maybe a little self-aggrandizing, but we already have people who invaded Crimea on behalf of Russia integrating into top leadership with separatist organizations here, right? It was this early on, and this is being posted April 26th, but this is only after that transfer had happened. So we have to assume that these folks were there prior. It's also at this time that Ukrainian government classifies these groups as terrorist organizations, and this is when the anti-terrorist operations began. Propaganda would say that they are calling the Ukrainian government are calling their own people terrorists and attacking their own people and bombing their own people, right? And yes, in war that happens, and there were some bad people involved. I mean, right sector was a thing, Azov Battalion was a thing for sure, but that is not representative of what was actually happening in the upper echelons of Eastern Ukraine, right? And it was designated a terrorist organization because it was at this time that people like Igor Girkin were arriving, that Wagner group was arriving, that Pavel Guverev, Russian National Unity former member, right, is talking about separatism, right? That's and storming buildings and taking over regions, right? That's the terrorism in which the government in Ukraine was reacting to. However, that is what in a lot of Western, at least social media disinformation, is portrayed as Ukraine attacking its own people. And a lot of that misinformation begins at this very time. And Pavel Guverev himself is posting this stuff, right? The man that said, right, we will exterminate Ukraine is also holding up a hashtag Save Donbas. So that type of misinformation is just key for people on the left to grasp, right? That at no point did Pavel Guverev ever legitimately care about this stuff, right? He's talking about exterminating people a few years later. He's reposting people talking about the liquidation of the country, the culture, and the economy. He's meeting with Alexander Dugin, right? So this is when the propaganda begins, this early, and it was very influential to thought in the West, especially people that are center of or left of center. There's images here from Pavel Guverev in the Novorossiya account talking about Ukrainian troops attacking suburbs. There's a image, for many reasons I won't get into, just an ironic image of Pavel Guvrev standing in front of a map of Ukraine split in half with a sign that says hashtag save Donbas people from Ukrainian army. And this was posted by the People's Militia of Donbas. In July of 2014, we have Pavel Guvrev talking about the genocide of Donbas continuing, shelling of residential buildings. And there was even, this was in the comment section, someone saying that we need help finding or preparing videos in English. Very serious people associated with the US Republican Party asked for a new hashtag, I don't know what that means, in English, about the current situation in Ukraine, about the genocide on the part of the nationalists and more. We'll get to the Republican Party in the United States later. We're not there yet, but it's just insightful that from 2014 in this era, right, people saying we need this propaganda in English. I speak a lot about people on the left. Of course, this was also influential to people on the right too. It did become apparent early, though, for those who were in leadership of this separatism, that Donbas was not going to go as smoothly as Crimea, and because of that, or at least partially, due to that, Russia did not swoop in. Right, it wasn't a Russian operation. Although Igor Girkin talks about how that was the expectation of those involved early on. But so this is from Infiltration, Instruction, Invasion, Russia's War in Donbas, Nikolai Mitrokhin. And it's from page 232 of a much larger document. Moreover, in the regions controlled by the pro-Russian fighters, the population did not behave as expected of them. Across the entire region of Donetsk and Luhansk, only roughly a third of the population supported the idea of becoming part of Russia. And then it talks about, pro-Russian fighters and how they had to convince or try to convince people to join this effort. Going down to the next paragraph. Even in areas that were supposed to have been, areas of strength for these groups. As early as May 18th, the leader of the fighters, Igor Girkin, appealed to the citizens of the People's Republic in desperation, complaining of an acute shortage of military manpower and calling on men and women to join the troops. By this point, structures had already been put in place in Russia, enabling the recruitment and transportation of soldiers willing to go to Ukraine to fight for Russian world. Right, we talked about the Russian world a little bit earlier. But even at that early in May, and this would have been 2014, Igor Girkin having difficulty finding people to join the militia. Here we have a figure that we will get to later. There's much more about this in another video I have, Nazis in Donbas, but he's the leader, the commander of a special task force that was connected to the Wagner group Rusich. And we'll get to them. But in this interview, regardless, from a separatist channel, Novorossiya, he's talking about how men are trying to escape the war in Donbas and how they should be mobilized into the DPR by force. He goes on to talk about or degrade these people, essentially calling them dogs, and saying that they should be in one way or another forced into fighting with the separatists because they're not choosing to, essentially. And they even started using Girkin as like a propaganda tool. First to bolster military advances, but also in terms of humanitarian needs, which is just very ironic. This being a Russian that took place in the annexation of Crimea, who's an imperialist, using him as a symbol of humanitarianism. But they did. So one of the accounts, called Humanitarian Aid to Donbas, has an image of none other than Igor Girkin in the center with some fancy writing on top of it. The alternate of the U.S. Confederate flag being the symbol for Novorossiya at this time. And then a number of men behind him holding weapons. And it's asking for humanitarian aid, right? So support with a repost. And you click show more, and there's now defunct sites where you could go and donate stuff. Next to that, in September of 2014, I have a picture of Pavel Guvarev with his arm around Igor Girkin, again, showing the coordination between these individuals. And then also on the right, this is from the Novorossiya DNR LNR account, just showing, Girkin being used as propaganda. And this is for supposed military victories, right? But the use of a figure like Girkin, again, someone who today is dismissed or is attempted to be like delegitimized, he was like key and central to these early operations. He himself is an imperialist. He himself is from Russia. He himself only was in Ukraine due to the annexation of Crimea. And then he decided to lead his group of little green men into Donbas, right, to support the separatists. The idea of him being used as a face for like humanitarian aid or even propaganda is just something that folks in the left might not understand. And this slide is just simply a collage of other posts that are pumping up Igor Strelkov, essentially, Igor Girkin. I put them here for the dates, just to confirm, that he was there. One of them is from May in 2014. One is from July 2014. I put another one here too, which is interesting because it shows the same propaganda image that was used in the humanitarian effort post, along with a church, I'm guessing Russian Orthodox church, that looks like it had been shelled. And so the roof of the church is on the ground. There's a picture of Christ on the ground and people like holding hands in it too, appealing not to some Russian or not to some communist socialist project or something, but I mean, this is appealing to that imperialist Orthodox, angle. And we're going to meet those groups very soon. But also the propaganda of lionizing this individual, putting this individual as like a protector of Russian Orthodoxy, right, against this evil Kiev junta. Separatist military success was bolstered by Russian support and Russian extremists. Again, either ideologically under the concept of Novorossiya, based on an ethno-state, or simply politically minded, for Russia. But along with Igor Girkin's unit that engaged after having taken part in the Crimean annexation were other Russian paramilitaries. Some of these were official, such as the Wagner Group and Special Task Force Rusich that we will get to. Others are given free rein across the border, such as Gubarev's former RNE, Russian imperialist movement, and Russian Orthodox Army. All of these organizations are racist extremists acting on behalf of the ideological concept of Novorossiya. Many worked with Ukrainian far-right groups prior to the Maidan protests. Talking about RNE, Russian National Unity. If you're listening, the image is shown of Pavel Guvarev as participating with the Russian National Unity Group. Nazi sig heils being given, him wearing a shirt with their emblem on it. But, interesting too, and I did this with Task Force Rusich later, interesting are the comments, because even people that were commenting, this is VK, so even people commenting on Russian social media don't necessarily know what this means, right? So, this was posted in response to Pavel Guvarev saying that he was at like an anti-fascist conference, and people are, some very few, but there were some that pushed back on that, and this was one of them. But underneath the comments to that reply were others saying, what is RNE? And another person saying, and this is from 2015, right? Another person says Russian National Unity. And then another person kind of commenting, this is something of the right sector of Toko in the 90s in Russia. The main Barkashev was declared itself in the early 90s, probably the strongest organization of nationalists. So, I think that that's really insightful, because even people, in that area or region it's not like everybody knows who the Aryan nations are in the United States. And it's not like everybody knows what Russian national unity is in Russia or Ukraine for that matter. So it's just interesting, people asking, but then people giving honest responses. This is something of a right sector in the 90s of Russia. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. So let's talk about who they are. It's interesting because their Wikipedia page shows that they're defunct. I don't know where they got that information. I'm not into suggesting edits, but I would suggest an edit for that. So Russian National Unity, led by ultra-nationalist Alexander Barkashov. We showed him earlier because he was reposting stuff from the Russian imperialist movement. It's an unregistered neo-Nazi group based in Moscow. Active groups exist and post daily on VK, as does Barkashov. So again, I push back because I've seen them posting and they post a lot. It isn't as if they post like once a month. It was very difficult to get back to 2014 because they post so frequently, actually. Barkashov and Russian National Unity, RNE, members were both active in Donbas. Many key figures in the separatist movement were connected with RNE, including Pavel Gubarev. So on the right side, I have an image, and now this is an older image. The movement Russian National Unity was founded by Alexander Barkashov in October of 1990. This is from their social media again. So this isn't an article about, this is actually them describing who they are. Alexander Barkashov began his path as a Russian nationalist and Orthodox fundamentalist back in 1985, joining another organization called National Patriot Front, and later becoming a leader within that, and then founding his own movement, RNU. These are posts from Alexander Barkashov's own accounts. And so again, it's not like this is like groundbreaking or that I'm digging around and infiltrating. I'm just looking at what these folks post. And people in the West just don't see it because they're not on these platforms, right? But here's one, I think the most significant one is from August 13, 2014. Alexander Barkashov posts a picture of a group of men, soldiers, and it says, a subdivision of Russian National Unity somewhere, right? And then he talks about where they're at, but it's Donbas, right? And this is important because, yeah, I mean, they're not defunct. This is 2014, and he's saying that a subdivision of Russian National Unity is in Donbas, right? There's another image, or there's another post. This is from 2020, but it's an old picture, and he says Luhansk, summer 2014, counter-sabotage unit. So these are images documenting Russian National Unity in the region as well during, I guess, what we could call the Russian Spring, right? Now, this is from a different account, but this is like a Russian National Unity account. It's not Alexander Barkashov's personal account. But so this is them telling you, this is the same account where the previous image came from. This is them telling you what they did. From the spring of 2014 to the present, RNU has been sending volunteers to Novorossiya to protect the Russian people from Ukrainian aggression. Here's a picture from his personal account. Russian National Unity. While many ultra-nationalists from Russia are openly anti-Semitic and racist, they do not often praise Nazi Germany, at least openly, due to the nature of Russian nationalism. However, this is not the case with RNE. Here we have Barkashov sitting in front of a Confederate flag, and a quote, "I consider Hitler a great hero of the German nation and of all white races. He succeeded in inspiring the entire nation to fight against degradation and the washing away of national values." I also have some posts from his personal accounts. However, not necessarily going to read them all. They're all very racist. I had to block some words out. He uses the N-word for some. He talks about quote unquote multinational garbage in Russian land, showing ethnic minorities. There's another one that's kind of like a LaRoche conspiracy about the British family. He's talking about how they're Jewish and how that's a global conspiracy. It's all not good stuff. And this is more from the Russian National Unity social media site, discussing how they are based in Orthodox Christianity. So this would be a religious extremist group. and also some ethno-state stuff going on too, talking about the tribes, and they list many old tribes here, and how essentially Russia came to be, right? And then and if you're listening, it's men dressed in armor with a Russian national unity flag behind them. And then to the right of that are it discusses the glory to Russia, is what they call it, which folks in the West would understand to be the Sieg Heil salute. And they go into depth about what it means. But again, it goes to Christianity again and the Old Testament. Continuing with their self-explanation of who they are. RNU, which is Russian National Unity, perceives the nation and the world as a battlefield between the forces of God and the forces of the prince of this world, the devil. The modern, quote-unquote, progressive civilization, with its striving for, quote-unquote, world integration, a, quote-unquote, new world order headed by the, quote-unquote, world government, is the power of the, quote-unquote, prince of this world, the Antichrist. So, yeah, they would be opposed to the EU. And I have more up here for folks who might want to pause this. I'm not going to read through it all, but something else important for audio listeners. At the end, the last paragraph, they say by the word Russia, they explain what this means. And it's not the current Russian Federation. It's according to a 1,000-year tradition before the upheavals of 1917, including essentially the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus. And they use antiquated terms for that. The Great Russia, which is a chauvinistic term, the small Russian, and the White Rus, right? So Belarus, the White Rus, and then the little or small being Ukraine. And these are examples I pulled from the Russian National Unity site. They repost a lot from White Nation. So I don't know what connection, but it feels as if it's more than just simply liking a page, but I don't have any evidence of that. So I have some pictures here for audio listeners, left to right, from the Russian National Unity social media page. One is a Russian soldier next to an American soldier, the Russian soldier holding the Russian flag and the American soldier holding a flag of Texas in front of the Alamo. And so this was in support of potential separatist efforts in the United States, which was interesting. They forwarded a picture from White Nation from Fort Bragg, which is a military base in North Carolina, a bumper sticker on a sign with Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and I'm assuming the last one is COVID. It's a syringe all crossed out saying zero tolerance for these things. Lots of anti-COVID stuff on this page. More White Nation things, people with their faces blocked out holding a flag that says White Lives Matter. A woman with Confederate flags next to her, reposting of the KKK, KKK, numerous KKK flags. And this had to do with an immigration rally, or anti-immigration rally, I should say. We have the White House spokesperson, who is an African-American woman. And then below her, a doll with dirty hair, and it's obviously meant to be racist. And then lastly, again from White Nation, but reposted by Russian National Unity, Joe Biden, quote, whites becoming a minority in America is a source of our strength. And so it goes on to talk about a whole lot of replacement theory stuff. Something to understand about this group and many of the groups involved, even those who might adopt Soviet era propaganda, they are not Bolsheviks, and they are not looking for some type of Leninist or Marxist revolution. Were there people in that region who were immediately snuffed out by these forces? Yeah, sure, but they had nothing to do with this and the Russian Spring, right? Those were different, and this is why talking about separatism can be a little complicated. But this was posted by Russian National Unity. They are very much against communism, at least in terms of the Bolshevik Party. And so for listeners, this is the hammer and sickle with, crossed out, a black box on the bottom saying the Bolsheviks physically destroyed 70% of the clergy, which is their the main issue, it seems like, desecrating and destroyed thousands of churches, etc. So, interesting on the Wikipedia page for Russian National Unity, it says it no longer exists, but we have the founder showing that it does exist, right? However, if you dig into their wiki page, it does talk. Some of the linked sources do talk about splinter groups or factions that occurred, and it could be argued, and I don't know the specific ins and outs of this, but it could be argued the Russian Orthodox Army might be at least an offshoot of Russian National Unity, and they were also present in Donbas as well. I have some screenshots here, mainly for the dates, and one shows a person, soldier of the Russian Orthodox Army, and the date is August 22nd, 2014. So that's the summer of 2014, right? The Russian spring going into the summer, I suppose. An interesting thing about these images as well is that there's a hashtag on the upper left-hand corner of one of them that says hashtag Donbas against Nazis. And this is, of course, one of those like Novorossiya channels again. And it's, this, I think, exemplifies why the complication of talking about not what Nazi means and what, like anti-fascism might mean to some, not everybody, but to some people in this region, because it's very different than what we might think of it in the West. And by that, I mean, this is, Russian National Unity itself, its leader has talked positively about Hitler, right? For instance, this Russian Orthodox Army either being an offshoot or adjacent to Russian National Unity, in that it's a Russian Orthodox extremist nationalist paramilitary terrorist organization, is depicting itself as being anti-fascist. Whereas in the West, I think that these things get kind of combined. So where, you might say you're a Christo-fascist, right? But because, again, of that nationalist chauvinism, right? And then Russian world, the Great Russia, these patriotic historical views that people in this region have, and not all of them, but a good number of them coming from World War II and identifying the defeat of Nazi Germany as kind of being against the West, even though the United States was allied technically with the Soviet Union during that time. But this idea of Nazi becoming this general thing, right, of EU integration or of NATO integration or of Europe, etc. Right? And again, that's not the case for everybody in the region, but I think that this is an interesting case study in having what someone in the West might call a Christo-fascist, right? A Christian fundamentalist engaging in paramilitary or terrorist, again, depending who you ask, activities, a fundamentalist with a hashtag above it, against Nazis. So just running through this group quickly so we understand, who these people are now in the foundation of a greater Novorossiya. Established in 2014 after training with German right-wing extremists, accused of kidnappings, beatings, and threats towards Protestant, Catholic, and Ukrainian Orthodox members. The group has participated in acts of anti-Semitism, and it was absorbed into the United Armed Forces of Novorossiya. Again, interesting, you don't hear about this. You do hear about, of course, something like the Azov Battalion being absorbed, decommissioned, absorbed, and reconfigured within the security forces or under the Ministry of Internal Affairs within the Ukrainian military. Not that either of those things are good, but again, it shows you the bias and misinformation that exists, just the lack of information that exists in the West pertaining to what actually happened in Eastern Ukraine. So the Russian Orthodox Army, ROA, arrived early in action. We saw those were depictions in the summer, most likely arrived a bit earlier than the summer, maybe late spring. ROA occupied Ukrainian security service buildings in Donetsk and were placed there by Igor Girkin. So, yeah, direct lines, which makes sense, Igor Girkin being at that time the head of essentially the military for the area. But, making those connections to who was doing what and who in power, right, was how they were deciding things to be done. Who are they deciding should be carrying out these things? It wasn't residents of Donetsk who took up arms. It was people like ROA that came from Russia. ROA also fought with the East Battalion at the Donetsk airport in 2014, which was a very significant battle in the bigger picture of early separatist efforts. Battles like this were portrayed as the people of Donbas versus Ukrainian Nazis in Novorossiya and other VK accounts. And I have an example of something like that. Pavel Guvrev reposting, DPR, militia holds back the attack on Donetsk from 3 sides. Militia manages to hold back the junta's onslaught. Right? So, even there's nothing involved, right? They're not saying who is fighting, right? Or who is composing this specific militia. The ROA was, very much likely to be there, along with other private military companies too from Russia. But in this portrayal, it's the militia or the people holding back the junta, right? The evil coup of Ukraine. And yet another screenshot from a video of Russian Orthodox Army, and in this they're standing in front of the separatist flags, those black, blue, and red flags that we saw with the Eurasianists in the 2000s, right? So a video message of the newly created Russian Orthodox Army appeared on the network. They said that they would guard the so-called referendum and create a rapid response team. Representatives of the Russian Orthodox Army and all power blocks of the People's Militia will guard the referendum on May 11th. Representatives of the Russian Orthodox Army and all power blocks of the People's Militia will constantly be in the area of the polling stations, only in plain clothes, so as not to attract unnecessary attention to themselves. Now, this should be frightening to anybody, but the idea that this extremist religious terrorist group with members from Russia, the fact that they're essentially being polling observers and in plain clothes so that you can't identify who is who, this tells you, it gives you some insight into what those referendums were really like. And just in general, it's just important, I think, to note that in this general space, in this general Novorossiya separatist space of 2014 social media, that spring and summer, there's just so much just racist and anti-Semitic content, and not all of it is being posted by people in positions of power. Much of it is in comment sections below it, but it just needs to be called out because there is this false idea that people in the East were fighting, these evil Nazis or something like that. Right sector and Azov are a problem. Yeah. But looking in this section of who the separatists are as well, there's no shortage on their side either. And so to just give some examples, in the upper left, there is this old Jewish, kind of canard of confusing white people and creating conflict amongst them for their own gain, financial and power. And in this example, we have one person with the EU flag and Ukraine flag pointing to what on their side is a 9, and another person with a Russian and Novorossiya flag pointing to what on their side would be a 6, with a anti-Semitic, the hook nose Jewish caricature in the center with money signs coming out of his mind. Another one depicts Ukraine, And some of the people that we've even talked about, like Yulia Tymoshenko in the center, with a Star of David behind her, and other prominent Ukrainian leaders with rabbi hats on, right, and like hair like rabbis, locks, yarmulkes, etc. So it also says dead Ukraine, or Ukro-Nazi, good Ukro-Nazi. So again, it doesn't need to make sense, right? These Jewish people are the Ukrainian Nazis, I suppose. In the center, Pavel Guvrev is reposting something from the Novorossiya DNR LNR account that says Ukrainian tanks are controlled by dark-skinned mercenaries. And then there's a picture, and it looks like it's hard to tell, but it looks like maybe it's supposed to be an American patch, but it's curved. I can't tell. But anyway, it's the idea that there are Black people fighting on the Ukrainian side, right? And that's an issue. Another Novorossiya account talking about how Zionism is a true enemy of humanity, a small group of super rich Jews who can be conditionally called a Jew is trying to destroy 90% of the world's population. Below that, a response to something that Paul Guvrev had posted, the history of Russia 2014, the war in Ukraine. Jews are attacking. There is a rabbi depicted there as well. So just all this anti-Semitic, racist conspiracies, not even contained to these paramilitaries that we're talking about, but it's just generalized to this community of people. And this brings us to Special Task Force Rusich. And these folks aren't as well known in the West as, say, the Wagner Group. However, since in the past few years, since the Wagner Group has expanded so much, the connotations of Nazism have kind of drifted away from them. In a strange way, they've almost become mainstreamed as a mercenary group. However, maybe, like a 2B, a much lower 1A to 2A, 2B is Special Task Force Rusich, at least in understanding in the West of some of these paramilitaries. But they're specifically useful because of their out and out embrace and contradictions, again, of just, white nationalist, extremist, Nazism, anti-Semitism, etc. They're very useful because the propaganda is in your face. And so you don't need to pick through it and try to, backtrack and say, well, this is actually a religious group, however, etc. And, a great image to depict this, and this was off their a fan page on their social media group. It says, Defenders of the Blood. It shows this like sun swastika symbol that they use. It's two men holding guns with another white nationalist symbol on the back of a man. They have ski masks on. Below it, it says, unit is not funded by the UE and NATO. Okay, so the European Union or NATO. So there's a NATO flag crossed out. There's a rabbi, and his face is crossed out, and there's the NATO star, which is crossed out. So all of these things are conflated into kind of like what Russian National Unity was talking about, which in the West, we would recognize this as the one world government, maybe Aryan nation, far right conspiracy theory against Jewish people, right? The kind of the Jewish canard of either whether it's blood libel or whether we're talking about elders of Zion, right? Which Russia, but that's how we would recognize it. However, in this separate context, it's flipped on its head, right? So Task Force Rusich. So they're interesting too, and I think I've heard differing ways of saying it, Rusich or Rusich, but I don't pretend to have an accent that works. But this is interesting too, because like Russian National Unity, I did find the picture. So backtracking here, Pavel Guvrev posts an image that's a repost of the Donetsk DPR News, Donbas, Russia, Novorossiya SVO. And this is supposed to be like an update. And this is from the Luhansk Republic, right? And it says at 5 o'clock in the morning, militiamen fired at Ukrainian cartels, called up from the Lviv region, as a result of the attack. About 30 militants were killed. So it's supposed to be this update about how great this like people's militia is, right? Okay. The people in the picture that he posts are members of Task Force Rusich, which is an extremist group that is loosely tied to the Wagner group from Russia. And he doesn't bring this up. And this is exactly like before, where he was talking about the civilians of Eastern Ukraine having protests, and it was RIM members, with the Eurasianist flags mixed in too. But what's interesting is in the comment section below, there are these comments, like one person said, handsome men, right? These are real warrior men. God help you guys. Carry on. Well done. So I think it's safe to say that, at least in this, like, it's safe to probably say, hopefully, the commenters didn't know who these people were, right? But especially the man on the far right with the beard is definitely a member of Task Force Rusich. And this image has been shown in other articles. Sometimes the faces are blurred out about Special Task Force Rusich. And so here are some close-up images without sunglasses on and without face masks. And there's that man that we saw in the previous slide on top. And this is from November of 2014, right? But they were there before then. We'll see. But even being there as early as 2014, below is kind of like the commander of the unit. That person below, who I said was like the commander of the unit, it's this person who we talked about earlier. When it said propaganda aside, it became clear that Donbas would not be the next Crimea, discussing how there were issues with getting people from the region to join their ranks. The person that was shown earlier holding a straight up German Nazi flag, I mean, no hiding that. That person is the same as this person who was in Rusich here in Donbas, who was depicted by Pavel Guvarev, saying that these were like, the militia standing up to the evil Ukrainian junta, right? The propaganda, and people in the West wouldn't know this. Now I'm just showing a side by side, one image of the man holding a Nazi flag and the other of him in uniform. This is another image that I got from they have Special Task Force Rusich has fan groups out there. And this is one of their this picture that I'm showing is from one of their groups. I'm showing it. It's kind of like an homage to the group. There's pictures of them, pictures of the two men that we saw. On the bottom, it looks like maybe some gear. But the point in showing this is that flag again, right? The black, gold, and white flag that we saw earlier. It's sometimes inverted, right? This time it's inverted. But referencing everything we talked about before with RIM and that imperialist flag. And here's another kind of, this is really useful, I think, imagery, because it to me, it provides insight again into a different point of view than I think people, again, in the West might get. So it shows the sun style swastika that Rusich uses on the left, and it's surrounded by a number of other emblems, versus, and then on the right is the Azov Battalion, who we hear so much about. And the interesting thing about the Azov Battalion here is that the flags surrounding it include the flag of the United States, the flag of Israel, the Star of David in the center, a flag that says NWO for New World Order, and then a flag with the pyramid that's on the back of on the back of American money. That's tied to all these conspiracies, right? There's a Masonic sign. All of these conspiracies, I'll put it that way. And so it's not saying that, like, oh, we're against you being anti-Semitic. We're against the Azov Battalion because they're not that they're anti-Semitic. That's not what this is about. As a matter of fact, they have their own swastika they're showing. It's that this supposed Nazi group is working in combination with a Jewish conspiracy and other conspiracies that kind of mesh into this mind melt of what in the West we would probably think of as being right-wing stuff nowadays, QAnon stuff nowadays, But here it's saying like make a choice. And I don't know that this image would make much sense to somebody from the West. This image here shows again the commander and other members of Task Force Rusich here holding a flag that is in solidarity with Donbas, and it depicts the altered Confederate flag that was being used at first for Novorossiya, as well as that double eagle stamp on top of it. Motorola. So why are we talking about Motorola? Because he is pertinent to the discussion now with Task Force Rusich. However, we have to go back because this person was in one of the first slides that we looked at. He was in the slide of a divided Ukraine next to Pavel Gubarev when we were discussing some of the very core concepts of what Novorossiya is all about. So this image was in the very beginning, and now we're bringing that full circle. In the upper right corner, there is a YouTube link from a Rusich fan group, I guess you could say, or support group. And when you click on that, it brings you to the screenshot that I have to the left of it from YouTube. The writing is not in English, but you can clearly see Motorola in there. And the names around him, specifically GIWI, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, refers to the individual in the picture with the beard who is part of Task Force Rusich, as we've seen in the previous pictures. So, Rusich and Motorola work together, essentially. And, this would make sense, right? These are the Russian paramilitary extremists that I've been talking about the whole time, who have been involved with this since the very beginning. So below all of this is a post by Pavel Gubarev from 2016. This was after Motorola was killed, and we'll talk about how he was killed. But it reads, Motorola was killed. He entered the fight at the very beginning at the end of February 2014. So put a pin in that. That means that you had Russian paramilitaries already entering Donbas in February of 2014. He was a man, brave and desperate, bold and tough. My relationship with him ranged from genuinely friendly to overtly tense. In the volunteer revolutionary movement, there are no people with simple characters. So was Arsen Motor, as his relatives called him, a man symbol, a hero of Novorossiya. Rest in peace. We will not forget you. Okay, so he was a hero of Novorossiya. At times, Pavel was genuinely friendly with him. So who was this person that is a hero of Novorossiya but was working with Task Force Rusich? Well, okay. He was a Russian who entered Donbas in 2014. He became the leader of the Sparta Battalion, a pro-Russian armed group. He was sanctioned by the United Nations in 2015. The Kiev Post broke a story about him, stating that he killed 15 Ukrainian prisoners of war. The conversation was intercepted by a telephone call. In that telephone call, which was intercepted, he went on to say, I don't give an F about what I am accused of. Believe it or not, Motorola said, I shot 15 prisoners dead. I don't give an F. No comment. I kill if I want to. I don't if I don't. Pavlov and the Sparta Battalion also murdered prisoners indiscriminately. He was killed in 2016 when an elevator at his apartment exploded from an IED. The battalion was part of the Russian People's Militia military unit in Novorossiya, but was later integrated into the Russian armed forces in 2022. The voluntarily formed unit uses a combination of symbols of the Spartan military culture, well-known drivers of the far right, and from the Tsarist era. So it's an ultra-nationalist group. Here's another propaganda image, I suppose, from Rusich here. Now this is interesting because at the top, even though Task Force Rusich is in and of itself an extreme right-wing group, it reads on the top, against Zionist Banderist scum. And then directly below it is their sun symbol, of the swastika. So, it's just, again, for Westerners, this is kind of hard to get, but I think by now we should be understanding, right? Not all society, but with certain members, there can be differentiation, right, between being, first of all, a fan of Bandera, and then connecting that to Nazism, right, which in and of itself is its own separate discussion that we won't get into, but then also calling that supposed Nazism Zionist. It's just a combination of a lot of conspiracies that in the U.S., these are things that you see on like deep in Stormfront, boards, places like that. And an interesting thing about about Special Task Force Rusich is that when presented with information like this, and when you're dealing with people that are not operating in good faith, a lot of the pushback that you have is, well, these groups weren't part of the Russian military, even though a lot of them fully integrated in, especially after 2022, as we saw. But that these were just volunteers, and that they were kind of like crazy nobodies. And you get that across the gamut to try to dismiss the importance of them. But, Rusich isn't like that. There's images of them being given credit, I suppose, or being validated with their sun swastika, or whatever swastika, full out in display. Everybody knows who these people are, holding Nazi flags, giving Sig Heil salutes and stuff, and committing war crimes. So this doesn't come from a place of ignorance, right? But what I'm showing here, and again, this is from the fan club, basically, are photos of them from the International Conservative Forum. This was an International Conservative Forum that we'll read about later, in which they were like one of the a very key part of this. They were kind of celebrated in this, and there are pictures taken of them with other people, and the group with other people. They're kind of celebrated like kind of like heroes. And in the images here, you see it's very much like what you would think a business trip would be. They're wearing lanyards in the whole 9 yards. Now, there are articles about this conservative form. This isn't the only one that occurred, but I took directly from the social media and just translated it because obviously it wasn't in English. But so the translation reads, on Saturday and Sunday, a Congress of Nationalist Movements called the International Russian Conservative Forum took place in St. Petersburg. More than 400 delegates from Russia, Serbia, the USA, Finland gathered, as well as representatives of the Greek Golden Dawn, British BNP, German NPD, et cetera, Italian groups, Bulgarian groups, virtually all major European national parties. They gathered, ununanimously expressed their supports for the actions of the people of Donbas and Russia. This is what Novorossiya was. This is what that project was. The project was supported by 400 delegates from across Europe, the US, etc., of ultra-nationalist groups. On another piece, it says, the will to organize a movement that would serve as a common tribune against threats to national sovereignty and identity was expressed. This movement is to become the cornerstone of a new world that we should build. So this is what Task Force Rusich was a part of. And in a smaller scale, this is what Novorossiya was a part of, a cornerstone of a new world that should be built. And this is a language that we hear when you look at Eurasianist writing, when you read stuff by Alexander Dugin. In the left, or in the West, this type of language can be misconstrued for anti-imperialism, right? Or this kind of language can be misconstrued for critiques of globalization, right? Or critiques of NATO, right? That's, while those things are used as propaganda and excuses for far-right nationalists, that's not exactly what it is that they're talking about. And their intentions and goals are bipolar opposite of what people in the West might think when we're talking about those. Here I have some other images of Task Force Rusich. This is from Facebook. And the translation from this Facebook post, which shows members again in a hall being honored. There's media around. It says it's from Moscow. I might mispronunciate this. Bahatur Hall in Museum of the Great Patriotic War. New Wars, New Heroes, Fame. So regardless of my butchering of the name of the hall, this was in a Museum of the Great Patriotic War, New Wars, New Heroes, and Fame. That's how these folks were treated. And on this slide, again, not in English, it shows two of the members on a news station. And in this news station, they were talking, I believe, about allegations of torture, in which they were denying them. But it's just when we talk about the mainstreaming of supposed like far right figures in Ukraine, for instance, that's fine. Like that conversation needs to be had. However, where the bad faith comes in is when it's not also had on the other side, or when it's used to excuse the actions of the other side. And this is the other side. Right? These people are being treated like heroes. They're on TV. They're semi-celebrities, right? Now, what does that manifest in the long run? That's different, right? But who they are, what they're doing is fully recognized, and they have, my gosh, fan clubs. So this is hopefully starting to sound familiar. And for audio listeners, I have just some random things. How about Gubrev wishing Assad a happy birthday for some reason in 2014? Images depicting the country of Ukraine as being, a Nazi country. UN Security Council resolutions talking about what happened in Libya a number of years ago. The idea of genocide happening in quote unquote Novorossiya. Another post from the People's Militia of Donbas saying that the war is not even against the Banderaites, but it's a U.S. war against Russia. That's from April 2014. All of this is where all the accounts that we're going to look at in a moment and others. This is where they get their stuff from. This is where they get their marching orders from. This is where they get the template of their information. Right. This propaganda has existed for a number of years. For 8 years. And people in the West who are just monetizing this and flipping it, either just for money or out of some ideological goal, this is where they get it from. It's not like this is some insight that people have, right? This is just government propaganda from Russia rehashed 8 years later on social media platforms that are more accessible to Westerners. Propaganda use in the U.S. and domestic connections. People have struggled to identify, classify, and critique figures connected to or using these narratives. It has become lucrative and a way to divide solidarity from the left. Here's a screenshot from Jackson Hinkle, kind of owning this meme. It says, "We are Z," with the Russian Z symbol, and just a number of people across the board, from Alex Jones to Jimmy Dore to Donald Trump, Aaron Tay, Max Blumenthal, Caleb Maupin, Tucker Carlson, etc., Nick Fuentes, all the worst of the worst, crammed into this meme saying "We are Z," and it's true. We're going to see that some of these folks, we struggle of whether they're grifters or whether there's ideology involved. And we'll see that it kind of doesn't matter because the connections become very firm very quickly. Initially, pro-Russian war correspondents and political bloggers like Gray Zone were pumping Russian state propaganda and presenting it as an alternative or contrarian anti-US critique. Over time, this morphed into smaller third parties adopting language, such as the YouTube, Twitter-heavy MPP, or Movement for a People's Party. And we can see here, for instance, some of the use of the verbiage of Alexander Dugin and multipolar world, disband NATO to end the war in Ukraine, right, placing no blame on Russia. Unfortunately, this has bled over to larger and more meaningful entities, such as parts of the Green Party and even at times parts of the DSA. The spectacle that was Rage Against the War Machine turned this into an event hosted by current and former RT media personalities, libertarians connected to the reactionary Mrs. Caucus, Ron Paul, and others who profit in one way or another by pumping government propaganda. While this can be dismissed as a clown show, there are direct connections ideologically and organizationally with some involved. Matthew Heimbach is a perfect example of this. Heimbach is a known white supremacist, neo-Nazi. He attended Rage Against the War Machine with pamphlets stating, "No more American imperialism," and "We won't fight another rich man's war." These sentiments mirroring those of speakers, but of course coming from a disingenuous place of bad faith, like all of the speakers. We might just say, okay, so Matthew Heimbach is a white nationalist that is, spinning things and putting it on its head, portraying himself as being anti-war and anti-imperialist, right? Well, not so much. Here's an image of him standing in front of a version of Separatist Novorossiya flag. Underneath the writing says, Matthew Heimbach Center stands with other white nationalists underneath the Novorossiya flag in a photo he published on his personal Twitter account in May 2016. Heimbach, an American citizen, claims that Russian President Vladimir Putin is the best European leader of the 21st century. So it isn't just that this white nationalist was invited purportedly by the Center for Political Innovation, or maybe Caleb Maupin himself, to this pro-war, pro-Russian protest, which essentially the purpose was to make money, but also to claim that we can only have peace if Russia is appeased for having invaded in the first place. So it isn't just that. It's that this individual actually knows what Novorossiya is. I mean, and it should align with him because, well, look what we've read and learned up to this point about the concept of Novorossiya. And here's yet another picture of Heimbach in front of an associated flag. But this is really where the connection comes in. This is more than a LARP or mere fandom of a reactionary movement occurring halfway across the world. For example, Heimbach met with delegates of the Russian Imperial movement. And I know this because this is from their social media accounts. This was among their media, underlined in a collection of photographs of Heimbach with Confederate flags, with the Russian Imperial flag that we showed in the very, very beginning, that black, gold, and white flag. Amongst all of these, it states the RID, which is the Russian Imperial Movement delegation, at the invitation of the leader, which is Heimbach, of the Traditionalist Workers' Party, visiting the United States of America. And sure enough, there's pictures of Matthew Heimbach next to delegates, representatives of RIM, the ultranationalist terrorist organization that we read about. Recall that when we were transitioning from Russian national unity into who RIM was, we looked at this image as well, just to confirm of what that black, gold, and white flag symbolizes. It symbolizes the Russian Imperial movement. Recall, this group is one of the extremist reactionary paramilitaries that invaded Donbas to create Novorossiya. The crossovers and overlap of ideologies cannot be ignored. From the influences of Laroche to Dugin to Eurasianism on both those who organize separatist efforts and carry them out, to those who present this propaganda domestically in the guise of anti-imperialism. While this is a newer phenomenon for the fake left, it has been ongoing from the right, for which many of these grifters align with. More than just alignment are actual connections, such as Trump's campaign manager also having been campaign manager for Viktor Yanukovych under the employment of the Party of Regions. Steve Bannon, echoing this Novorossiya concept that Ukraine is not even a country. Dugin himself saying that he ideologically aligns with Bannon. Even prior right-wingers were fascinated with both Putin and the conservative regime of Russia. This is a Pat Buchanan article from 2013. Is Putin one of us? This, like many things, is a mere end result packaged for public consumption. Working backwards, we can see the very reactionary language and ideas used in more extreme spaces, inevitably leading us to authors like white supremacist Andrew Anglin and message posts on white power sites like Stormfront. And this makes sense, as those assisted and who could be argued to have made possible the separatist effort in Eastern Ukraine were and are extremists themselves. This has created a confusing environment for anti-war, humanitarian, and leftist groups in the West who try to parse through the onslaught of government propaganda, much of which has even infiltrated groups they previously had supported and internet personalities with huge numbers of followers. However, the objective reality is that Novorossiya is a reactionary, imperialistic concept that was realized by Russian extremists, while protesters in Russia have been imprisoned and tortured. Minorities in the region have been targeted for forced military mobilization, as have Russian protesters who have been jailed. Those who protest, even in the most simplest forms, are prosecuted with new laws, such as this. Russian prosecutors requested a 2-year jail term for a single father accused of discrediting the army, with his daughter, 13, at risk of being kept in an orphanage. And compound on all of the targeting of anti-fascists and real anti-fascists, the torture of them after having been imprisoned, the crackdown on anti-war protesters and free speech, the forced military conscription of anti-war protesters and anti-mobilization protesters, the targeting of ethnic minorities for military conscription into the invasion of Ukraine. Compounding all of that are just simple and straightforward human rights violations committed by any and all of these ultranationalist paramilitaries that we've seen, separatist groups in Eastern Ukraine, and the Russian government itself after mass mobilization of 2022. Novorossiya is not a leftist concept. What happened in Eastern Ukraine, at least in the upper echelons of power, after the first few months into the Russian Spring, had nothing to do with being anti-fascist or attacking Nazis. Those who say that are speaking in bad faith themselves and are themselves defending fascists, ultranationalists, and human rights abusers. Not only do folks in the West not really have a good grasp on what Novorossiya meant ideologically, politically, ethno-state-wise, as we've talked about in this video, but there's also not a good grasp, again, on this idea of denazification and what that really means. But up to this point, I hope that we've learned that you can be denazifying while essentially being a Nazi yourself, to what folks in the West might consider looking at the people who are involved in conducting this quote unquote denazification, the Wagner Group, Russian National Unity, Task Force Rusich, et cetera, et cetera. But it goes beyond that now as we get caught up to 2022. And this is from the Moscow Times. It's called "Who is the Author of Russia's Blueprint for Genocide Essay?" Timothy Sergestev outlined how to quote unquote denazify Ukraine in an essay entitled "What Russia Should Do in Ukraine," that was ironically published the same day as evidence emerged of war crimes by Russia in Ukraine. It called for the ideological repression of civilians and arguing that Ukraine should lose its sovereignty for at least a generation. An obscure columnist, political consult, and spin doctor, he has never before attracted such media attention, even though he worked for high-profile clients, including pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. One of the participants in this philosophical club for which he is a part of said it involved discussions about developing the idea of Russian world, which was used heavily by Russian nationalists after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and in the Kremlin support for rebels in eastern Ukraine. Other arguments made by him in his article include that the vast majority of Ukrainians are Nazis or have links to Nazi ideology, and that they need to be, in quotes, re-educated through, quotes, ideological repression and political, cultural, and educational censorship. He has also suggested that the new people's republics should be formed to replace the state of the modern Ukraine. From another article, Justification of Genocide, Russia has openly declared its desire to exterminate Ukrainians as a nation, discusses this article. It states that in the article, What Should Russia Do with Ukraine? He justifies the need for mass repressions against Ukrainians in order to force them to abandon their nationality, culture, and language. He uses the Russian propaganda term Ukrainism to describe an artificial anti-Russian construction that does not have its own civilizational content, a subordinate element of an alien and alien civilization. This is what Alexander Dugin wrote back in 1997. The main thesis of the article is the extermination of Ukrainians as an ethnical group, not only through quote-unquote denazification and de-Banderization, but moreover through so-called de-Ukrainization, a rejection of the large-scale artificial inflation of the ethnic components of self-identification of the population of the territories of historical Little Russia, New Russia, that begun by Soviet authorities. The author adds that denazification of Ukraine is also inevitable de-Europeanization. So talking about Little Russia, New Russia, Novorossiya, this goes back to the very first slides that we were looking at. This goes back to the map of the mid-1800s, talking about Novorossiya, the Little Russians, right? The White Russians, etc. That's what this is about. De-Europeanization, being connected to de-Ukrainianization, being tied to denazification. That's what we talked about when we were saying that there are people throwing Sig Heil signs with swastikas on them, calling themselves anti-fascist. And this is what people, especially some people on the left in the West, don't understand. That when they echo the sentiments of denazification, they are advocating for, as Pavel Gurevich put it, the extermination of people. Or as more recently, this Russian author that worked for Viktor Yanukovych put it, as essentially repressing every aspect of what it means to be Ukrainian, because it is an alien thing. It's a disease. Here, I'll just pause reading through the article itself. It states the Bandera elite must be liquidated. You can feel free to read this, as I speak if you're watching. I'll link all of these articles for those listening to audio. But this is genocide speech. This is saying that all Ukrainians are Nazis. That all Ukrainians, or I should say all Ukrainians who think that Ukraine should exist, that they directly or indirectly have sympathies to Nazism, as was described earlier. What does that classification do for Russia? That classification allows for, in 2022 and after, the targeting of civilians. because the civilians are no longer innocent. Civilians are now open to being targeted. Civilian infrastructure is open to being targeted. Why? Because they are implicitly supporting Nazism, and the goal of this is denazification. It isn't about the Azov battalion. It isn't about right sector, and it's not about Oliver Stone conspiracies about what happened at Maidan. It's about ethnic cleansing. And this is something that people on the left in the West need to understand. That instead of standing back and objectively critiquing, perhaps, the Azov battalion, now the regiment, sure, let's do that. We can have that discussion, right? But without putting that in proper context, right? By echoing sentiment of Russian propaganda from 2014, and by not critiquing what Russia is doing, and that by completely overlooking and dismissing what happened in Donbas in 2014 with everyone that we just looked at, you are advocating for aiding and abetting people who are committing genocide. It's not about the United States. Not everything is about the United States. This is about the liquidation of a people. And that's something that the left is going to need to face, especially when you have people ranging from Jimmy Dore, social media, to former Green Party candidates, trotting out there on stage along with other people that have literally met with some of these groups at the after hours party, saying that they are anti-war. That's a reckoning for the left in the West.